Over many years, Blizzard has introduced so many different systems, patches, updates, and changes to the World of Warcraft. Some of them have become defining features of the game that have been carried forward and well remembered by so many of us. Others are things that have been left behind and that we'd probably sooner forget. But what were the best features and what were the worst? Today I'm going to be covering what I feel was the worst feature of each of World of Warcraft's expansions so far. And yes, this will be fully in my own opinion, so I'm expecting people to agree or maybe disagree on some points. But with all that said, there's 10 expansions to get through and a lot of years of content. For me, these have to be the worst features in each World of Warcraft expansion. Starting from the start, of course, in Vanilla. It's difficult to look back to Vanilla now, having played it back in the day in 04 and 5, and then its re-release in Classic in 2019. And those two things are very, very different experiences. The worst feature of Vanilla originally was the fact that I still had to go to school and couldn't play the game all day. But really, how can I criticize a time so steeped in nostalgia? On its re-release in 2019 though, I do think Classic started to show that there were some decisions in the game that didn't quite hold up as well these days. So for the worst feature of Vanilla, I'm going to go on the artificial restrictions that are placed on the game by the developers. And what I mean by this are just numbers which can't go above certain points. Take for example the debuff cap in Vanilla. Originally, you could only have 8 debuffs on a target at one time. There was of course 40-man raiding, and one player could do half of those debuffs pretty easily, and I can only imagine back in the day it would have been an absolute mess of just people overriding each other's debuffs. In patch 1.7, around when ZG was released, they raised this debuff cap from 8 to 16. This did make things a bit more flexible, but really it was still the case that you were only allowed to apply debuffs which were benefiting the whole raid, such as Curse of Recklessness, Sunder Armor, and so on. Serpent Sting? Nope. Moonfire? Nope. Corruption as a warlock? Maybe if you're lucky. In future expansions they'd raise the debuff cap to where basically it wouldn't apply anymore, but I don't think it was the best feature in Vanilla. Along the lines of restrictions, there was also a buff cap where you could only have 32 buffs at one time. Sounds pretty excessive, but if you're fully buffed up using all the world buffs and consumables, you can reasonably hit that number whilst you're in a raid. And for example, if you were playing a restoration druid and you wanted to use rejuvenation on a warrior, you would actively be griefing them by giving them the possibility of removing more important buffs. That was the state of some classes in Vanilla. Again, a lot of buffs were consolidated and world buffs were removed in future expansions, so that wasn't a problem anymore. And the final restriction that's definitely worth a mention for Vanilla has to be spell batching. On Vanilla's re-release in 2019, Blizzard recreated this system where effectively spell inputs had up to a forced half a second delay. This did try to emulate how things were back in the day, but it just ended up being really scuffed. This spell batching window essentially meant that spells were dealt with in a group every half a second rather than being resolved as soon as possible. So what this meant is sometimes, for example, you could land a heal on a tank, you spend your mana, but the batching window hasn't occurred yet, so you lose all your mana and the tank dies anyway. I think it was an interesting idea to try it again. It just didn't work. The Burning Crusade. On we ventured through the dark portal into a mysterious alien world. This was back in the good old days of midnight releases and queuing outside your local game store to pick up a copy. Things were very different back then, and they were different in the game as well. One of the most defining features of the Burning Crusade has to have been attunements. Now I've gone on record a bunch of times and said, actually, I think attunements are pretty good, and I'll stand by that. They are pretty good. The first time, when you're going through them with your guild, you're seeing all the content through, you're getting a first look at the dungeons. It's a pretty satisfying ladder to have to climb. The problem comes along when you want to play an alt, or maybe even a character after that, because you need to go through this entire attunement process on each one. And the attunement process in TBC was long. The real simple way of explaining it is to get onto each new raid tier, you had to have completed the raid tier before that. And in TBC, people typically weren't going back to old raids as much as they were in Vanilla, so when new people came along and tried to join your guild, it was often the case that you had to rerun them through this old content again and again to try and get them up to speed, only for inevitably the roster boss to hit, people quit, you need new recruits, and you just got this revolving door of trying to get people up this ladder to the point where they can raid where your guild's currently at. In time, Blizzard would dial these attunement requirements back a lot, and in future expansions they basically did away with this system entirely. So as interesting as achievements were the first time around, they just didn't hold up well long term. Wrath of the Lich King, we finally head to the frozen north to take on the infamous Arthas Menethil and the armies of the Scourge. What a hype moment that was. You know, before having replayed Wrath Classic, I might have even picked the looking for dungeon system here, but now having replayed the game with it, honestly, I don't particularly mind being matched with people for a dungeon. I'd still be fine with traveling there by myself, I don't think that's a big deal, but I think it's just worth it in terms of making the content more accessible. A lot of people would also look to Trial of the Grand Crusade as a rather lackluster raid, and again, after having replayed it, the raid was fine. Personally, I didn't like the RP between each boss, and I would have preferred some trash to kill rather than hearing about Wilfred Fizzlebang summoning Jaraxxus for the 1000th time. But the bosses were fairly interesting, it was short and sweet, it was rewarding on loot, and it was the first raid ever to have heroic mode as an optional toggle. So you know what, Trial of the Crusader, not that bad. I think if I'm picking for Wrath, it's gonna have to be something which is a bit of a cop-out and that I could have really picked for TBC Wrath or Cataclysm. But for me, I think this is the right thing to pick, and that'd be just the lack of content outside of raiding or PvP. Yes, Wrath did introduce achievements, there was a bunch of reputations and so on and so forth, they crammed in loads of daily quests as updates came in through the game, but there just wasn't that extra stuff to do with your character. Once the raid was done, if you wanted to do more, it was make another character and just go do the raid again. And it's not as though I'd want a system where we need to complete some task or we fall behind in character power. We know they did that in the future. But just something else I can throw my character at and, well, just a reason to play the game a bit more. I felt that was missing from Wrath. Onto Cataclysm and the Shattering, a controversial expansion, and that's still true by today's standards. And my pick for the worst feature of this expansion is the easiest one on this list so far. Say it with me, everyone. LFR. The goal of this was very noble. They wanted to get more people into raiding because raiding in World of Warcraft has consistently been a strong point and something that people around the world still enjoy to this day. But the execution on it was just really not good. Ghostcrawler even went on record during an AMA when he was at Riot saying that LFR was one of his biggest regrets at his time at Blizzard. The problem was that it created a revolving door of people joining and leaving a raid, hoping that you can bash your head into a boss hard enough for it to finally fall over and cough up some loot. And originally in Dragon Soul, which is when LFR was first introduced, it was very much worth doing, even for the top guilds in the world, because of how powerful the tier set bonuses were. In fact, both Paragon and Method at the time got a ban for exploiting an LFR, and it was also kind of difficult in its first iteration. Obviously, if you're in an organized raiding guild, you just walk over it and say, "What is this joke?" But for an unorganized pug group, this could be a real challenge. And you know what else LFR didn't have in Cataclysm? Determination stacks. The only thing that, well, determined whether you're gonna kill the boss was whether the people in your group understood it and were willing to put in the effort. And that's why LFR has to be my pick for Cataclysm. Onto a rather unexpected expansion now, where we head over to Pandaria to do battle with feelings, amongst other things. Pandaria is weird. Back in the day, people criticized it so much, and yet we look back now and think, damn, this was a pretty good expansion actually. So for me to pick its worst feature is a bit of a tricky one, to be honest. I could, for example, say there was a lot of daily content. I think people forget that about Mr. Pandaria. There truly was quite the list of stuff that needed to be checked off. Maybe Thunder Forging from the Throne of Thunder. I think that in many ways paved a lot of forging effects that we'd see in the future, where luck could increase the power of your gear dramatically. But it was still pretty tame in Mr. Pandaria, so I'll give that a pass. You know, if I have to pick one feature of Mr. Pandaria, it's probably one of the biggest additions that it's made to the game, and one that's still as visible today as it was when it's released. So for Mr. Pandaria, I'm picking Pandaren. Yep, the new race that was added in Mr. Pandaria is my choice, and I just think they don't really feel as though they fit in. They look fine in Pandaria when they're out on Half-Hill farming away, or laughing and eating together, but when you take them into the wider Warcraft universe, they just feel kind of goofy. In fact, there is one defining thing which has definitely pushed me towards picking Pandaren here. So at the start of Mists of Pandaria, I made a Pandaren monk. I imagine many of us did. I wanted to see the new zone, get a feel for them, and then take that new class into the expansion. And I never played a monk properly at endgame or got into PvP or raiding with them, but I'd always level it up all the same just to see how they played in each expansion. And I believe it was in Legion when I did a paid race change off of Pandaren just so I didn't have to look at it anymore. Again, I didn't race change for any endgame reasons or racials, but I just didn't like the character. So that's why for Pandaria, I'm picking the Pandaren. Following Mr. Pandaria, of course, we move onwards, or I guess back in time technically, to Warlords of Draenor. I guess this is an expansion where I'm spoilt for choice, and unfortunately, not in a good way. You know, the content that did exist in Warlords of Draenor was largely okay. Now, I'm kind of split on what I do want to pick, as admittedly what I want to say isn't necessarily a feature. I guess the easy choice is going to be garrisons. They completely messed up the expansion launch. Some people couldn't play for days on end, and then as it turned out, everything that we ever possibly needed ended up being available in our own instanced little world, complete with mission tables to go and have NPCs farm gold for us. Interesting idea, and perhaps the closest we're going to get to player housing in World of Warcraft for a long time, but it just panned out terribly. But ultimately, what I'm more disappointed with in Warlords of Draenor has to have been regarding all of the cut content. There is so much stuff that just didn't happen in this expansion. The Farallon zone to match where Burning Crusade's Neverstorm was. There was early concepts of a Zangarmarsh zone, and then they just flooded it and called it a day. Faction capitals were supposed to be in Frostfire Ridge for the Horde and the Temple of Caribou, aka the Black Temple for the Alliance. These were cancelled, and instead we had what felt like a temporary camp either side of Ashran. All the raiding content itself got released within the span of a year or so, and the final patch just went on and on. Perhaps worst of all, where's the dance studio, Blizzard? So I know it's not technically a feature of the expansion, but just the amount of stuff that we didn't end up getting has to be my choice for Warlords of Draenor. But then we get to Legion and everything's lovely again. Wonderful. There's so much to like about this expansion, but admittedly early on into it, it did very much have its problems, and my choice has to be with Legendary RNG. Legendaries are a huge feature in Legion, and they could alter your character's power by a pretty enormous degree. Not only that, but there were so many different legendaries you could get, and your character's chance of getting the first one or two was greatly improved. After that, you better hope and pray to see future legendaries, so it was really important that you got a good first legendary. People doing Race to World First would level multiple characters just to see what legendary they got. If you hit a bad one, that's too bad, reroll time. In time, Blizzard will make it a bit more lenient on legendary RNG, and then right towards the end of the expansion they introduced a currency where you could create legendaries. But early game Legion was definitely not without its problems, and I think early game legendary acquisition was the worst part of the expansion. And then we get to Battle for Azeroth. Much like Warlords of Draenor, I'm spoiled for choice, and not in a good way. There's definitely a few contenders here between Warfronts, what I took to be a PvP related piece of content, which was kind of an auto-complete PvE event, bizarrely, needing to do islands which was running around the circle, and at least on the harder difficulties, trying to avoid everything from one-shotting you. But I think overall it has to have been Blizzard's bombardment of daily, weekly, and even monthly tasks that your character needed to do to stay up to power, both with the Azerite armor and the Heart of Azeroth. Lessons would be taken from this expansion in the future, and they were hard-learned ones at that. It was an expansion with its good points too, but as for its worst one, it has to have been the character upkeep. And then we get the 1-2 punch after BFA in the Shadowlands, and oh dear, unfortunately things aren't getting better just yet. Again, it's an expansion with several contenders. How about the more early on where you just had to run around on foot for ages? Perhaps Torghast, which was advertised as a roguelike feature within World of Warcraft that ended up being very tame and having a lot of overly simple bonuses. Maybe Covenants, where going into the expansion we were assured that if things weren't working out and people weren't able to make a meaningful multiple choice, that the ripcord could be pulled, and Blizzard will be able to sort it out, which just turned out not to be true. All of these will be a great pick, but I'm gonna have to go for something else, and the thing I'm gonna pick from Shadowlands is gonna be the story. I'm not even a big lore guy within World of Warcraft. On my first playthrough through a new expansion, I'll take my time, I'll watch the cutscenes, I'll get involved with the story. I'm not looking to rush towards endgame, complete content like it's a checklist and log out as soon as possible. I've been there, I've done that. I'm not doing that these days. But the story was just bizarre. I don't think there's another better way to put it. This jailer character who had just popped up in this expansion had been secretly influencing everything in the background right from the start of Warcraft. And then he refuses to elaborate on this and then dies at the end of the expansion and says, yeah, well, wait and see, there's something worse than this coming. We had the all-powerful Sylvanas who had been built up since BFA, and I think people are a little bit tired of her, and it was just a bizarre retcon of so many years of lore and story within the game. And I think moving past Shadowlands, we just kind of need to sweep that one under the rug. We can double retcon it. Shadowlands was definitely a low point for a lot of people, but the story has to have been my pick here. And then we move on to Dragonflight, our expansion that we've just come to the end of, and one that was very well received after a rather rough few years at Blizzard headquarters. And out of everything in Dragonflight, my pick here is actually really easy. And for me, the worst feature of this expansion was, hey, it's like I'm in Mr. Pandaria again, because I'm gonna pick the new race, Drakthea. I think they're really underwhelming model-wise. When people saw a dragon race, they thought back to the hulking draconids that you get in Blackwing Lair in earlier versions of the game. I mean, if there was an option to have a skinnier one and then a bulkier one, it would have been fine, but there is no option. You're just some salamander-looking boy. On top of that, it's like Blizzard just forgot about how many years they've gone through trying to make Druid's forms look cool and customizable, because when you enter combat as Drakthea, you're forced into your dragon form where you can't even see your armor. Imagine being the guy who has to make tier sets for Drakthea knowing that they're never going to see them in the first place. For an expansion where so many things were done right, it just seems like they missed the mark thematically on this new race. As far as I know, in the War Within, you can stay in combat in your Visage form, and maybe even one day they'll open up other races to becoming evokers. If they do, that's an easy paid race change for me, by the way, Blizzard, I'm just telling you. But for Dragonflight, it has to be Drakthea. And finally, the War Within. Yeah, we're super early on into the expansion. I know we haven't seen the full content by any means, but I guess that's where we are at the moment, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna throw something here in the video just as some early thoughts on the expansion. And my pick for the War Within so far has to be underground zones. So there's two that I'm thinking of in particular. Okay, yes, there are 3 underground zones technically in the War Within, but Hallowfall just doesn't feel like you're underground because the skybox is absolutely enormous and you've got the big lava lamp looking thing in the sky anyway to keep the lights on and make things feel a bit more bright and vibrant. But Ashkahet and the Ringing Deeps, yeah, not so keen on them. The thing is with underground zones is nowadays we have dragon riding, or sky riding I suppose, and this form of flight is just so fast and agile that when you're underground there's all these pillars everywhere in the way, you can't necessarily go over things, and it just feels a bit cramped for how quickly we can move around the map now. If you look at how Blizzard designed Dragonflight with its huge wide open zones with all these wonderful skyboxes and vistas, you can really tell how they played into that. And yes, there was the Zaralak Caverns in Dragonflight of course, and I pretty much have the same comment for that. It just felt a bit cramped when we're so agile nowadays. But for the War Within, my pick is going to be underground zones. And hopefully that is the worst thing I have to say about it. Though we'll see if any more get added in the future, you never know. But that's it, what I feel as though was the worst feature of every single version of World of Warcraft so far. Raiding's been my favourite thing to do in World of Warcraft for the longest time now, and I think it's one of the areas of the game which has remained a high point for so many people. Whether it was banding 40 people together in vanilla to slay a dragon for 2 bits of loot to share across the entire raid, or in more modern World of Warcraft taking on mythic bosses which are so difficult that there's professional guilds competing to see who can obtain the world first. Raiding has always been a core part of this game, so each expansion and major patch for that matter, must have raids, which means there has been a lot of them in World of Warcraft's 20-year history, and though there are so many great raids to pick from, some of them I would sooner rather forget about, and those are the ones we're going to be talking about today, picking out the worst raid of every single version of World of Warcraft that has existed so far, minus the War Within, because as of doing this video, there's only one raid tier in it, so it wouldn't be exactly fair to pick. We're also going to be starting from vanilla and then ascending up the expansions, so with that said, let's make a start. Starting where it all began, of course, in vanilla. For the first version of WoW ever, there was definitely some great raiding content. The best raids of vanilla for me have to be ZG and Nax. But there was also some raids which, to be honest, I didn't really look forwards to doing. Molten Core, I have to be honest, is pretty low down on the list in terms of raids for me in vanilla. There's just so many bosses and trash packs where their mechanic is they're gonna put a debuff on the whole raid that you have to dispel, and then you pull something else and guess what that does? It puts another debuff on the whole raid that you have to dispel. Not exactly fun if you've ever played a healer in Molten Core. Oh, and there's also patrolling trash next to bosses that can chain pull, and even patrolling bosses themselves. I'd rather the bosses just stand somewhere ominously and wait their turn to be blown up by the raid in the space of about 1 minute, as is expected with vanilla. But Molten Core did have a big redeeming factor in that the loot from certain bosses was always exciting to see, so at least it's got that going for it. So the worst raid from vanilla, for me, I think it has to be AQ20. I think a lot of people would have gone for AQ40 due to the trash between Twins and Cthulhu, but I never found anything in there overly annoying. In fact, I think it was kind of cool to have a mount specific to the raid to appreciate the size of it. AQ20 though is just, well, it's a bit forgettable, isn't it? You have tons of roaming trash packs near the beginning which can easily be chain pulled if you are a bit careless, not to mention the wasp packs just before the last boss, AMS the Hunter. You know, the packs where one of the wasps debuffs somebody and then they get charged by another one, and if they use these abilities together, that person nearly always gets one shot. It does have some fairly interesting bosses though, such as Buru the Gorger, where you have to kite him around and he can chase any player, so it gives everyone a bit of personal responsibility. Not many vanilla bosses do that. Or Moam, where you have to use mana drains as part of the fight to stop him reaching 100% mana and just blowing up your raid. Then again, there are some not so good bosses, including, well, the rest of them, to be honest. I'm still not even sure what the first boss does other than wriggle about comically. General Rajax is hiding behind a wall and hoping people don't get randomly one-shot from the trash waves coming in, and Assyrian looks cool, but threat always seems to be a problem between the two tanks and the caster vulnerabilities, and AMS the Hunter spends half the fight flying, so your raid's 15 warriors are always complaining. There is some decent loot in AQ20 still, such as the bucks that give new spell ranks, but after a few clears you find yourself not really wanting to go back here anymore, so that's why it's the pick in vanilla for me. Next up is World of Warcraft's first expansion, and it had some really legendary raid tiers such as Karazhan or the Black Temple. TBC also, in my opinion, had the worst raid we've ever seen in this game, and it's just not close. The choice for this expansion needed exactly zero thought from my part. It's Mount Hyjal. It's going to be a pretty cool raid if you played the RTS games before World of Warcraft and you got to see a bunch of these fights play out in real time during the MMO, but that's kind of its only redeeming feature. The rest of it just wasn't good. Here's how it goes down. Instead of it being a regular raid where there's some trash and occasionally a choice of directions to go and bosses to face, here instead trash spawns in waves, and you clear enough waves and then a boss will spawn. The thing is that even when you get more gear, it still felt as though the trash took forever to do, and you had to wait for it to spawn in and then run to you, because if you tried to go to where the trash spawned, you could be pretty easily overwhelmed. Also, the trash packs were quite large, and half the classes in TBC, if not more, just did pretty much no AoE whatsoever, so it just felt as though you were waiting for the warlocks and mages to kill stuff before you can get to a boss and actually do some damage. And I don't know why, but this just felt so much more noticeable during Mount Hyjal than other raids, even though the same could be said for other raids and other tiers. And many of the bosses were just annoying to deal with. Anatharian could sleep people for 10 seconds, Khazragal spammed a war stomp that stunned for 5 seconds, and Aslagor would silence the entire raid for 5 seconds every so often. It just felt instead of an actual boss mechanic, you're being kind of inconvenienced. And after having had to sit through all that trash, you can't even have fun on the bosses because they just spam CC you. And worst of all, if you actually wiped on a boss here, you didn't just spawn in and get to do the boss again. You had to do all 8 trash waves that lead up to the boss again. Mind you, wiping was kind of hard to do on this content, content because fortunately it was not very difficult, unless you got a bug where as the boss spawned in it reset and you had to do all of the trash waves again despite not having wiped. I only saw this happen 2 times during TBC Classic, but it was just depressing when it happened. Oh, and a bunch of tier 6 tokens dropped in Mount Hyjal, so you pretty much had to come here every single reset. At least the raid wasn't super long, even though it often felt as though it was, but hopefully that explains why my pick for TBC is Mount Hyjal. Following that we have Wrath of the Lich King, another expansion which definitely had some raids that were better remembered than others. Back in the day, Trial of the Crusader was always seen as the raid that nobody ever liked. It was a rather uninspired room where the bosses were marched in one after the other, and it was in stark contrast to some of the better tiers of Wrath of the Lich King, such as Ulduar or ICC. But honestly, in Wrath Classic after Ulduar, I was ready for a shorter raid tier, and Trial of the Grand Crusader ended up being surprisingly fun, minus the whole needing to one-shot all the bosses to get the additional cloak item from the final chest that always put more stress on re-clearing than was really necessary. I'm glad they did away with this system. But the pick for me in Wrath of the Lich King is going to be what I think was very much a wasted opportunity in the Eye of Eternity, also known as the Battle with Malagos. His story is briefly explored in Wrath of the Lich King after we find out that the aspect of magic has gone a little bit mad and has decided that the mortal races and their use of magic was the source of all of Azeroth's problems, and therefore they need to be destroyed, which is, you know, bad. The Eye of Eternity is a cool looking room and one of the few areas of the game that still needed an attunement to access, the key being from Saffron in Nax, but the fight just felt a bit disappointing. Malagos, according to the lore, was the aspect of magic, one of the most ancient creatures on Azeroth, and possessed immense control over magic. So when we fight him, he just kind of stands there and bites the tank a bit, and then he calls over some dudes on floating disc things, and then he finally uses some proper magic and destroys the platform we were on. But then we get everyone's favourite part of Wrath of the Lich King, vehicle combat, where you just press 1 and 2 until the boss dies. This fight is just bad. I always felt as though it should have been more within the game than what we got. It's also way over in Caldera on the western side of the map, which at least in tier 7 is the opposite side from where Naxxramas is, and you have to fly all the way over there and do Eye of Eternity every week because the crazy dragon guy drops some really good loot. Despite being a one boss raid, the Eye of Eternity was just not fun to go back to at any point ever, and for that reason, it's my pick for Wrath of the Lich King. Next up is Cataclysm, which is our current classic expansion, I suppose that's the right way of calling it, and we're just about to get stuck into its final raid tier, Dragon Soul. And it kind of goes without saying what the choice will be here, but I don't think the worst raid of Cataclysm is anywhere near as bad as people make it out to be. Oh, also, I'm not going to pick Baradin Hold, it doesn't really feel like a raid tier to be honest. Dragon Soul is of course notorious in the World of Warcraft community among players of all types for being a weak raid tier, and admittedly it does have its downsides. I feel as though there's a lack of unique locations explored here, with us for the most part just circling around Wormrest Temple. We even get to go back to Malagos's room. Boss models are also often reused with Stone Giants, Servants of the Old God, and literally some random orc. And then there's of course the fight versus Deathwing, which takes place over 2 encounters. First fighting his literal immune system on his spine, and then afterwards defeating him once and for all when he's crashed into the Maelstrom. Sounds very cool on paper, but people often say it didn't really feel as though we ever fought Deathwing directly. The idea here from Blizzard of course was that Deathwing was so enormous that we couldn't fight him directly. It just wouldn't have been possible and wouldn't have looked good on screen. Anyways, I've been doing a bit of the Dragon Soul PTR at the moment, and I don't know what state it will end up releasing in, but currently I have to say that things are a bit more challenging from this raid than what I expected, and the bosses are actually kind of fun and will require some decent progression to get down on Heroic. Sure, some of the models are reused, but whenever I hear this I can't stop myself from thinking wait till you hear about Blackwing Lair, with its 3 in a row copy-paste 1.5 times scale dragons that have one mechanic different between them. I think something that didn't help Dragon Soul's memory in retrospect that it was the first raid ever where realistically everybody had the chance to clear it thanks to Raid Finder. There will of course be Raid Finder in Classic, and Blizzard are delaying it a bit so we don't know how it's going to look though. Raid Finder allowing everyone to clear and the raid tier lasting some 11 months or so before Mists of Pandaria dropped meant that everyone had time to be thoroughly done with it. Back from ICC to Kata's release, which was even longer than Dragon Soul by the way, there was still that mystery of the later bosses, which could take pod groups a very long time to work towards. And in Mists of Pandaria, another expansion with a very long fight final patch, there was a lot more non-raid content to do through the Timeless Isle and so on. Cataclysm, as you'll know if you're playing it at the endgame, is kind of just go do the raid and then, well, you can go do the raid on another character if you want to. So all in all, I think Dragon Soul is still worthy of the title of the worst raid of Cataclysm at this point in time, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be, and I think it's going to have a bit of a redemption story similar to Trial of the Grand Crusader. We'll see if I'm right or wrong on that. Next stop is MOP, a very controversial expansion when it first dropped in 2012, and one which a lot of people didn't even want to take seriously with its new panda-themed race. Despite that, looking back now, Mr. Pandaria did a lot of things very well, and we know we're going to be seeing it again following Cataclysm, so maybe this time around you'll give it a try. As a whole, Mr. Pandaria was pretty strong when it came to the raiding scene, so I think for me I'm going to have to pick one of the earlier raid tiers here. Mogushan Vaults, despite being a bit RP heavy with Lorewalker Cho yapping on, does have some cool encounters, and I think it was a good follow-up to the expansion story that was already established. Similar comments for Heart of Fear for me as well here, so I think the pick has to be Terrace of Eternal Spring. Not that it was a terrible raid, but I do have to pick one here, that's the point of the video. The first potential issue is that, well, it was really quite a short raid with 2 bosses in the same room, then you got 1 set of stairs for the next boss, and then another set for the final boss. Kind of similar to Trial of the Grand Crusader in that regard, in that it's practically a boss rush instead of having trash to break things up, but there is something I'm kind of dreading with the Terrace of Eternal Springs in advance of even playing Mr. Pandaria Classic, and that is the final boss, the Shah of Fear. And what seems most off-putting to me at the moment is that I know Method's world first kill back in 2012 was about a 21-minute boss encounter. Heroic Rag was easily over the 10-minute mark already, and having to progress that much into a fight and then you wipe and you have to do all of it over again did get a little bit tedious towards the end, especially when on Rag at least there were so many points when you could wipe. Imagine getting 20 minutes into a boss encounter then you wipe. That sounds not very fun if I'm honest. I mean, sure, we're gonna have our final patch balancing so our kills are on average faster, but believe me, the gap is closing with each expansion on progression kills for bosses. Many guilds in Wrath Classic, for example, hit and rage on Lich King before their first 25 heroic kill, and for example, Paragon's world first on Rag 25 heroic was about 15.5 minutes, and there are plenty of kills not too far off that range in Cata Classic on progression. I know it's probably a weird point to raise this much for the entire raid, but excessively long end bosses seem to be something that Blizzard were a bit keen on doing during this era of World of Warcraft. And that's without even mentioning Garrosh, which I know is another marathon of a fight. Either way, Terrace of Eternal Spring is the pick for Mr. Pandaria, which I'm going with. Which brings us to Warlords of Draenor. This expansion briefly appeared to be a return to form for Blizzard and World of Warcraft, before they saw the sharpest drop off in subs from any expansion ever. But don't let that fool you, because if there's one thing Warlords of Draenor did right, it was raiding. And what had quality over quantity, with 3 raid tiers to choose from, those being Highmoor, Blackrock Foundry, and Hellfire Citadel. All 3 were very good, which makes this a bit of a difficult pick. For me, it definitely won't be Blackrock Foundry. I think this was overall the best tier of Warlords of Draenor, with some really creative boss fights, challenging encounters, and the most badass Warlord of Draenor, Blackhand. Similarly, I liked Hellfire Citadel actually, despite it going on for ages before Legion dropped. There were more interesting boss fights in here, good loot, and a lot of the classes were just kind of fun to play by the end of WoD. So that really leaves Highmoor, which has to be my choice, and it's just a bit unfortunate because I don't even think Highmoor is a bad raid. It has perhaps one of the coolest starts to a raid ever, with you entering up into the arena gladiator style. I also like the 2 magic themed ogres towards the end of the raid in Korag and Imperator Margok himself, because you rarely get to fight ogres that don't just hit you with their fists. Highmoor just doesn't quite stand up to the bosses and theme of Blackrock Foundry, or the feel of advancing through Hellfire Citadel and eventually facing Archimonde for a second time. So despite being a pretty good raid in its own right, it has to be my pick for this expansion. After Warlords of Draenor, World of Warcraft saw a massive revival in Legion with legendaries, artifact weapons, world quests, Mythic Plus, and so much more. A lot of what makes modern WoW what it is all began here, and alongside that came a very strong raiding scene. The high point of Legion for me must have been the Nighthold, which is a top 5 raid ever in my opinion. But for the worst raid, well, it probably has to be the one right from the start, the Emerald Nightmare. The legacy that the Emerald Nightmare left behind was infamously being the easiest mythic raid tier to ever have been created. It was cleared in under 1 day from launch. It seemed as though Blizzard underestimated all the power that players were able to gain through optimizing legendaries and spamming Mythic Plus in More of Souls like a bunch of degenerates for hours on end. But above that, it just felt as though it was a bit of a wasted opportunity. The Emerald Dream and the Emerald Nightmare have been locations that were speculated on in the World of Warcraft community since vanilla. We know the devs were working on the Emerald Dream since vanilla. Of course, we'd finally get to see the Emerald Dream in Dragonflight, but in Legion the Emerald Nightmare just felt as though, wait, that was it? I guess I expected something more than that. Also, they randomly killed off Ysera as part of the Emerald Nightmare story, which I don't think a lot of people liked. But it's all good because they gave her a combat res in Shadowlands. Anyways, I felt as though at the time that the Emerald Nightmare was a bit of a letdown both under the weight of expectations and it being undertuned content-wise, so that's why it's my pick for Legion. And then we started on some of the lesser, well-liked expansions. In fact, many would say we had 2 of those in a row with the 1-2 punch of BFA into Shadowlands. But we have BFA first. Uldir was the opening tier, and it wasn't a half bad raid despite the story being, let's just say, a little bit more fleshed out on the Horde side, who had an entire zone built around the lore of this raid, whereas on Alliance it was kind of, yo, there's this place that you probably haven't been with this big evil thing in it, go kill it. I mean, sure, it's enough motivation for your average Azerothian adventure, isn't it? We also had some big lore character heavy raids with Ashara in the Eternal Palace, and N'Zoth in Nyalotha the Waking City. Not forgetting the Battle of Dazara Lore, a raid we swapped to the opposite faction for a portion of it to see both sides of the story. Very cool stuff. I think I could have picked Nyalotha for the disappointing ending where, similar to Dragon Soul, it didn't really feel as though we fought the big bad guy at the end of the expansion. But outside of that, the raid did have the feel you'd expect and visually was very cool, so from that standpoint I think it gets a pass. Which only leaves 1 raid from Battle for Azeroth, and there was a lot of raiding in this expansion in retrospect, wasn't there? The somewhat easily forgotten Crucible of Storms. Well, I say it was easily forgotten unless you were in a Mythic Progression guild at the time, because if you were, this place will be burned into your memory forever, because why on earth was this 2-boss raid so difficult, Blizzard? Crucible came a short while after the Battle for Dazara Lore as an expected mid-raid tier, perhaps a bit of a point of interest between this and the next tier, similar to what Trial of Valor had been in Legion, but it just ended up feeling as though it was an unnecessarily challenging raid for what it was. In fact, at the time, the guilds progressing on the world first would run multiple shaman, and after each failed attempt they would summon their shaman over to the end time dungeon and have them start a boss which had an extra action button which reset all their cooldowns, including Ankh, which didn't typically reset. Then they would summon them back over to the Crucible of Storms and have another attempt. And they were trying to skip mechanics for all these shaman deaths and having them self-res. It was just pretty excessive. Also, I think most of the other raid tiers in BFA were quite good, so that's why overall I'm picking the Crucible of Storms here. Getting towards the end of the road now, we have the Shadowlands. And for what Shadowlands was and how it's regarded looking back, it had an absolute banger of an opening tier in Castle Nathria, with some truly unique boss fights and memorable characters. It was an unexpected hit heading into this expansion. The other 2 raids in the Sepulchre of the First Ones and the Sanctum of Domination aren't held as in quite high regard though, and I think the pick for me has to go to Sanctum. By this point in the expansion, despite things starting off well in the Shadowlands, the story had taken several turns for the worse, and I think people had had more than enough of Sylvanas being the main character still. It was also quite a dreary setting for the entire raid. I mean, it made sense in the context, but still. I'll admit I didn't stick around for too long in the Shadowlands and only had a fairly brief experience of the latter 2 raid tiers, but from what I've seen from them, I'm going with Sanctum. Last but not least, we have Dragonflight. Dragonflight delivered on a raiding front, with I think Amir Drasil being one of the high points, showing us a much better representation of what the Emerald Dream could be than what was done during Legion. I think Vault of the Incarnates went down well too, so that really leaves us with Aberrus, the Shadowed Crucible. Though it wasn't the worst raid ever by any stretch of the imagination, I just don't think it's quite on the same level as the other two offerings that Dragonflight has, with Vault being a bit more exciting towards the start of the expansion and us getting to see all our new class talents and the systems that were in place, and Emir just still being thematically better. It's another case where it's the odd one out, and there isn't too much more to be added than that for me personally. And that is my list of the worst raid from every single version of World of Warcraft we have seen so far. Classic WoW was a time when things were simpler, leveling was a journey, gear upgrades were a bigger deal, and everything took a bit more time, leading to that much more satisfaction when you crossed the next big hurdle. Everything was just right. Or was it? Recently on the channel, we've talked about some of the more memorable things in Classic, such as the opening of AQ40 or the PvP system, and today I thought it might be fun to remember some of the more, how can I put it, painful things about this version of the game. Stuff you can look back at and say, oh yeah, that was the thing, wasn't it? And don't get me wrong, each of these in their own way added to the game and made it what it was, and some people will prefer Classic because of these gameplay differences, not in spite of them. Classic had so many unique, fun interactions and features which set it apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, but on the other hand, it could certainly create scenarios that brought out the worst in people, or just naturally seemed to cause problems. Between loot, PvP, guilds, and player-made drama, this has to be the worst of Classic WoW. So let's see, where can we start on things from Classic which were more than just a bit inconvenient? How about this little addition called spell batching, a phrase that will cause nightmares for even the most dedicated Classic player. This was a feature that was brought back to WoW Classic right at its inception. The idea behind it was to handle server-side resolution of spells more closely to what would have been the case in actual vanilla, therefore creating a more faithful representation of the game and emulating it as if we all had really bad internet. Instead of the server handling each spell the moment they were fired off, it would instead do them in batches, hence the name spell batching. This batch occurred every 400 milliseconds, so in other words, the game was running as if you were on 400 ping all of the time. Now, the positive upside of this, if you can call it that, is that certain spell interactions present in vanilla would be there in Classic, such as two mages polymorphing each other at the same time, or two warriors charging each other, and just a whole host of other random weird interactions. In reality, looking back, it was bad, like really bad. The warrior mains out there will remember pressing execute, having your rage bar go to 0, and then the mob dies before the spell is processed on the batch window and you do no damage. The same with taunting mobs, it was just very slow. Playing Alliance at the time, it was not uncommon to throw Blessing of Protection on someone and another paladin would do the same, and they would end up with several forbearance at the same time. And of course, everyone's blessing went on cooldown too. But the worst experience had to be for healers. You just couldn't reliably play a clutch healer. The amount of times I pressed lay on hands or went to heal somebody, went to 0 mana, and the spell never landed and they died was just so many, and it was so frustrating. This was the same experience for any healer. Finally, in patch 1.13.7, which was a few months after Nax Remus came out in Classic, more or less in preparation for TBC by this point in time, Blizzard changed the spell batching formula, moving it from a forced 400 milliseconds to resolving as fast as it could, or by at least 10 milliseconds. Even for the seasonal servers for Classic, Blizzard decided not to bring this interaction back. Either way, spell batching was certainly an experience, and just thankfully not one we have to deal with anymore. Here's another lovely feature of Classic, which I'm more than glad is in the past: debuff caps. So you know how in Wrath and, well, in TBC for that matter, you just used all of your abilities, your damage over time effects and so on that your class had access to? Well, in Classic, you couldn't. Anything that went above the cap would push off an older and often more valuable debuff from a boss. They were categorized too into major debuffs such as Sunder Armor. These were the big actively applied ones that benefited the whole raid. Medium, such as Corruption from Warlocks. These are often actively applied but only a personal DPS gain. And minor debuffs such as Deep Wounds, which were passively applied DPS gains. In original vanilla, the debuff cap was 8. Now, hypothetically, one Shadow Priest to DPS in any capacity needed at least 3 debuff slots, 4 if they wanted to use Vampiric Touch, and you could have up to 40 players in a raid. I think you can see how this had the potential to be a little bit problematic. Thankfully, in patch 1.7, that's ZG, Blizzard doubled the debuff cap up to 16, which was a lot more forgiving, and when we launched with Classic, we had this same level of cap in place. All of the same, it was not uncommon to have a raid sheet prior to even stepping into a 40-man raid with the debuffs which you are allowed to do. Let me tell you right now, Serpent Sting? Nope. Moonfire? No. Devouring Plague? No. Any minor damage over time effect? Basically no. Debuff slots were all taken up by the big effects that buff the whole raid, not personal DPS gains. Eventually, Blizzard raised the debuff cap to 44 TBC, which functionally removed it, and then went on to literally remove it for Wrath. But yeah, in vanilla, you really weren't able to make the most of your class's full toolkit just because of this limitation. Speaking of debuff caps, why not move on to class balance, a term that I use very loosely for Classic, because it wasn't balanced at all, not even remotely close, in fact. I suppose this is a side effect of releasing on last patch and then not changing classes at all ever afterwards, but there was such a big difference between the top and bottom damage dealers in Classic. Here, for example, is the last 2 weeks of 90th percentile passes for Wrath Classic. There's definitely some winners in this list, and it's important to realise there will always be winners, but the majority of classes at least have one fairly solid specialisation, and if we scroll down and look at the number of passes per class and specialisation too, I think there's a good overall representation. People are playing a bit of everything, and the majority of classes are seeing value. Here's 2 weeks of Nax 40 back in Classics, 90th percentile passes again. A bit of a different story, isn't it? With one class being so clearly ahead, you'd wonder why on earth anyone would play anything else. And looking at the volume of passes per class and spec, it's a similar story too. For every Shaman DPS, Druid DPS, Priest DPS, and Paladin DPS, that's nearly half the classes in the game by the way, there were nearly 15 warrior DPS. I don't think people were playing Classic for its stellar reputation for class balance, but looking back, I've never seen such a clear divide between the top and the bottom. But now we have our force lag, our inability to cast spells because our raid leader won't let you, and a class that's literally doing about 1/3 of the damage of the warrior that dinged last week. We now need to pick up some sweet loot so we can press Starfire rank 5 for about 40 seconds before going Fortunately, you don't have to wait to level cap for problems on loot. No, the developers have put a lot of thought into this. You'll be getting a first-hand experience on how loot will go the moment you accept that one quest in the Barrens that has you collect Zevra hooves from the apparently unhooved Zevras in the area. It's common for Classic, just because you can see the item you need on the ground doesn't mean it's gonna drop. I mean, looking back at this quest, there's comments back from original vanilla on how bad the drop rate was. Here's another good one, this one's for the Alliance, Farron's Proof. You know the quest in South Shore that has you go collect Murloc heads from nearby? This one always feels like more of a grind than it should be. Oh, and how about Fiery Blaze Enchantments? That quest in the Badlands where you have to kill the whelps and drakes over on the east side of the zone for the heart. I remember very well spending nearly 45 minutes on this once, and I just eventually didn't leave until I got the drop. But eventually you get through questing and hit level cap. Now this is where the real loot drama begins. I mean, where do we even start here? The infamous hunter memes from back in the day where they would roll on anything and everything because, I mean, hunters could equip practically anything and everything, bar plate armor and maces for some reason. In practice for Classic, it wasn't the hunters that wanted everything, it was warriors. Leather for DPS, plate for tank, resistance sets for certain fights, physical mitigation sets for others, you need your PvP set, one-handed weapons for fury, two-handed for arms, shield for tanking. Oh, and that healer gear? Yep, believe it or not, I also need that for my diamond flask snapshot. A warrior could legitimately have dozens and dozens of items in their bag and find a use for all of them. And that is kind of cool actually. But what about the fact your raid had 40 people and bosses dropped a handful of items, half of which were comically bad and were literally on permanent disenchant status? Oh boy, another Shadow Strike. Straight into the bin where it belongs. In fact, most classes wanted the same items too. There were just so many pieces which stood out clearly above others. Mage Blade, Talisman of Ephemeral Power, Quick Strike Ring, Onslaught Girdle, to name just a few from Molten Core alone. And every guild had an item that just didn't drop for you. I'm not even talking about bindings here either. I think between Blackwing Lair launch and AQ40 doing 2 raids a week, the guild I was with at the time saw a grand total of 2 mind-quickening gems. Every single mage wanted this item for PvP and PvE. It was so good it was still used in TBC. On the other hand, I believe we saw about 7 chromatically tempered swords in a row, which led to a lot of happy warriors and rogues about that bit of RNG. And not getting the item you want to drop is definitely still a thing in Wrath for sure. Malagos just refuses to drop anything which isn't absolutely garbage, but when you have 40 players, it's just a little bit more noticeable as all. Oh, and final point on loot, in case you had forgotten, vanilla had no tier tokens either, so you knew when you killed Rag or Nefarian or any end boss, they always dropped some nice druid tier for you, and the one druid in your raid got kitted out super fast. Next, something I actually quite enjoyed. So for learning professions beyond Journeyman, you had to go to a specific trainer somewhere in the world. Now, some of them weren't too badly placed. Expert Enchanting for Horde, for example, was in the Stone Talon Mountains, and for Alliance it was just outside of Stormwind. For the most part, it was a quick Google, and it takes a couple of minutes to get wherever you need to be. There was one big exception for a trainer who was just so far away from anything else that it was kinda just annoying to have to go there. Do you remember where you needed to go to train Artisan Enchanting? Keep in mind that during Wrath you can just train new profession skill-ups from any trainer. In Classic though, you had to go find Anora, who is of course located in the Badlands, just outside of the entrance to Alderman, as in she's inside of the dungeon exterior, but not in the actual dungeon of Alderman itself, if that makes sense. I guess back in the day this was found and shared by complete luck, but you clear this random pack of scorpions and she will appear just behind you. This kind of made it somewhat inconvenient to do on a lower level, though you did have to be at least level 35 to advance to the artisan level of a profession, but otherwise you had to go and fight your way through to get to this point. And unless you had prepared materials to level up as you were there, you were gonna need to make multiple trips here too. I mean, I get it, having trainers out in the world who are the only ones to advance you to the highest tier of a profession is cool and all, but Anora, could you just, you know, leave the Scorpion Pit when we find you for the first time maybe? Would that make sense at all? Let's move on though, because as things tend to be, the real worst stuff wasn't just the minor inconveniences of the game or things taking a little longer than maybe they could have. The real best of Classic, and often the worst, were the people on the server where you were playing. Now, people definitely bang on about server reputation and community back from vanilla, and I think mileage on that statement varies a lot from realm to realm, but what was true for certain is that other players could have a much greater degree of impact on other people's games. For the better, or in many cases, the worse. When the PvP system released in Classic WoW without Battlegrounds present, players took to farming honor from lower level characters out in the world, and on some servers even resorted to ganking inside of the opposite faction's capital cities because of how fast player numbers dropped in response to the relentless ganking. And when Battlegrounds were released, they wouldn't even prove a reprieve, as pre-mades of fully geared and prepared players would crush pugs in a matter of minutes to min-max their honor gains. And don't even get me started on how CC chains worked in vanilla. What are they capped at now, about 8 or 10 seconds maximum thereabouts? Well, in vanilla, sometimes you get hit by a polymorph and you just sat there doing nothing for 30 seconds straight, and then it gets recast again and you're sitting there for another 10 seconds. You can see why caps eventually got put on these things. Being CC'd for as long as a trash mob isn't too fun on the receiving end. But the cause of often the most drama had to be from world buffs. I'm not going to go over all the effort it took to assemble them here. I did do a video on it a little while ago though, so you can check that out if you wanted some more info. Suffice to say, raiding as a whole was shaped around collecting these buffs that made you do a ton more damage. And for the majority of Classic, you really did have to play around them. During the final patch, the same one as where they removed spell batching, Blizzard would go to introduce the Chronoboon Displacer. This would absorb your world buffs, pausing their timers and storing them to use at a later date. This meant you could, you know, play your class up until raid time, not have to worry about people who would hide characters around the world and try and dispel your buffs. More worrying is that people spent their time doing this, to be honest, and have everything ready for raiding when you stepped inside of an instance. When I think about this and look back to world buffs, it makes me realize I really don't miss them. Not only due to the whole factor of having to go and collect them, but what they meant for raiding. You can't have a decent progression fight alongside players potentially being 30% more or less powerful, and as great as the Chronoboon was, it wouldn't change that either. Still, this is something, one of many things, which sets Classic apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, and many players do prefer this version of raiding. or at least a version of raiding with the Chronoboon Displacer. Who knows, maybe Season of Mastery 2 will answer this demand. There are even a few more things I could have covered here. The one-button rotations, Biss from world bosses and having to camp them, the list very much could go on. And despite all this, despite it being called the worst of Classic, I still like Vanilla as a game a lot. It definitely has a ton of janky things, which by modern standards just wouldn't work in other games, let's be honest. But it's also proven to be a little more than just a bit of nostalgia. There's something in Classic which realizes that maybe it's not always correct to sacrifice something that's good to try and make it perfect. Over its 20-year duration, the World of Warcraft has kept getting bigger and bigger. Whether it was through major patches, updates, or entire expansions, MMOs are games that have to keep progressing and growing to fulfill the living, breathing worlds which they are supposed to be. And a core part of any MMO's growth in size will be the new zones for players to explore. Zones are like the building blocks which everything is placed upon, from gathering, questing, dungeons to raids. Everything takes place within the zones of the game, so we're going to need a lot of zones for a game that's been around this long. And while some of the zones in the game are hallmarks of incredible world building and fantasy creation, others are, well, not quite as well remembered, shall we say. And that's what I want to talk about today, what for me was the worst zone of every WoW expansion so far. For this, we're going to be going in order of zone preference from least bad to what I consider avoid if possible, but I do have to pick one zone per expansion of World of Warcraft, and trust me, some of these were really hard choices to make. We will begin with World of Warcraft's 4th expansion, and soon to be one which we will be revisiting in Classic, Mists of Pandaria. Now, to be honest, MMORPG didn't really have a bad zone pretty much at all, which makes it rather difficult to pick here since I have to. But if I do have to choose one, I think it'll be the Krasarang Wilds. This is a zone towards the south of Pandaria that you'll get to a bit later when leveling, but one that's always at the same time felt a bit optional to me, and that you don't really need to be there for all that long in order to get to level 90. So what were the problems with it? Well, for me the zone could feel a bit claustrophobic at times with all the trees which are there, and there are small rivers everywhere and just bits of water that you could accidentally run into. There also weren't any raids or dungeons, so oftentimes you just didn't really need to be here all that much. And I do remember some of the quests were rather annoying to complete as well. All in all though, not a terrible zone by any stretch of the imagination, but if I've got to pick one, that's what I'm going for Mists of Pandaria. Next up is the entry from Legion. Now, Legion as a whole probably had some of the best zones we have ever seen in World of Warcraft, and were it not for the content added in later patches, I'm really not overly sure what I'd be picking here, but for Legion my choice will be the Antoran Wastes. Added towards the end of the expansion, this zone was part of us going to Argus to confront the Legion directly, and as you might imagine, Argus was not really a very nice place to be, so in some ways I guess Blizzard did a good job here. I think Crokun and the Antoran Wastes are somewhat similar here, in that they both have the same kind of landscapes, high mob density, no flying allowed, lots of obstacles to get over or around, and so on. There were plenty of good reasons to go there though, from the daily quests, the new raids or dungeons, and of course the invasion points which allow players to very easily farm up legendaries towards the end of the expansion. Overall for Legion there were so many good zones that anything that wasn't outright exceptional did end up standing out a bit. Next we're heading to Battle for Azeroth, a less liked expansion by the community, but one which I think most would agree had many fantastic zones to play through, quest in, and explore. At the start of the expansion, each faction had an island with 3 different zones on that they would play through, and in my opinion all of these starting zones were great. In fact, similar to Legion, it's a piece of content which was added towards the end of the expansion that will be my pick here, and that will be for Mechagon Island. I reckon a lot of people would have gone for Nazjatar here instead, but I at least found that zone interesting with its different areas and content. Mechagon Island in comparison though just felt as though something was missing. It's supposed to be this island of super mechanical advancement and machines, but for me it just felt more like an island with loads of random bits of metal placed everywhere, and that at times it was a bit empty. Much like the previous zone, I don't think it was super bad by any means, but that would be my pick for BFA. Next up is the War Within, and I know we haven't seen everything everything from this expansion yet, I'm well aware, but in the other videos I've done similar to this, I have included it, so I'm going to do it here as well. At the end of the day, maybe my opinion will change between now and the end of the expansion, maybe it won't, who knows. Either way, with how the expansion has gone so far, it has several very strong zones, each of which could be someone's favourite with very good reason, which makes it pretty difficult to pick a least liked one. But that is the objective of the video, so I'm going to give it a go. So for the War Within, my picks so far will be Azj-Kahet. First up, I'm not overly a fan of underground zones when we have dragon riding. It just feels a bit confined given how fast we can move around the map, almost like we're being held back a bit. The second reason is it's trying to be Suramar 2.0. Now Suramar could legitimately be one of the best zones ever made in World of Warcraft. A visually amazing elven city with a progressive story over several patches where you couldn't fly at the start, filled with tons of content. Now the City of Threads within Azj-Kahet for me just doesn't match up. You can fly above any potential threats, it has much darker themes which, although fitting, just aren't as appealing to me, and to be honest I don't really find Nerubians to be a very compelling ally within the game. Suramar was dealing with Nightborn elves in secret out of fear of their rebellion. In Azj-Kahet you kind of just fly up and start chatting with some giant spiders who are hanging around. It doesn't have that same element of risk that Suramar had in my opinion. So that's for me why Azj-Kahet has to be the pick for the War Within. Next is Dragonflight, and it's in quite a similar place to my pick for the War Within due to mixing an underground zone with dragon riding, so it won't come as a surprise that my choice is the Zaralek Caverns. Similar reasons to Azj-Kahet, but it did feel a bit more enclosed at times and that there was even less room to maneuver around. Dragonflight was another expansion with overall strong zone design though, so not really too much to add on to this, but that is my pick here. The next few, if you have noticed so far, are going to start going backwards in expansions once again, but now we have the entry from Warlords of Draenor, which doesn't really feel like an earlier version of WoW, but on November 13th this year, it will be 10 years old. Scary, right? As much as Warlords of Draenor regularly gets ragged on by the community for having about as much content as the average vanilla boss had mechanics, one thing it definitely did right was its zones, and the reimagined Draenor was really something to behold, which makes me kind of surprised in myself that it even finds itself towards the middle to lower end of this list. But the zone that didn't quite pay off in Warlords of Draenor for me was Tanaan Jungle. So Tanaan Jungle was what I would call this expansion's Timeless Isle. Of course, the Timeless Isle was first done in Mists of Pandaria, and for me that basically means a zone with tons of stuff to do and to collect, from achievements to mounts, pet battles, currencies and so on. But for me, Tanaan Jungle was just not really a place I wanted to go back to again and again. I think mainly due to the colour scheme, the amount of obstacles that were always in front of you, and to be honest I also reckon it was partially because aside from the raid or PvP, you were going to be spending a lot of time in this place on your way to the next expansion. The same could be said for the Timeless Isle of course, but again it's just a preference thing as a whole. Next up is Cataclysm, and I bet you are waiting for this one. If there is anything overly controversial in this video, this may just be the one. So Cataclysm, as we all know, is the expansion known for having a certain zone which people either really love or hate. This is of course Vashj'ir, World of Warcraft's first and probably only ever fully underwater zone. And it is not the worst Cataclysm zone in my opinion. Not the best either, it would be somewhere in the middle for me. I think ultimately it was an interesting idea, but having that extra vertical movement axis was just too different from the normal format. So ultimately I would understand if they never wanted to commit to making another zone like this. But for Cataclysm, from all the new zones in the expansion, I'm probably going to have to pick the island of Tol Barad. The reasons are that it's not really connected to anything in the world, you kind of just teleport there from a random portal. It's got a very bland appearance. I mean, it is a giant prison on an island in the middle of nowhere, so objective complete I guess, but still. The main reasons to be there were for the dailies, which were pretty simple to do. After that you had the raid of course, and then the PvP and the battle for Tol Barad. And I remember the battle for Tol Barad was pretty bad back in the day, and now having redone it in Cataclysm, Classic, I can once again confirm it is still pretty bad. A rotation of a mass of unorganized players between several different bases which you are supposed to hold, where more than half the time the game ends after a few minutes because nobody wants to run the timer all the way down on defense, they just want the attackers to win so they can get out of there. Now we move on to Vanilla, which, I mean, sure, it's not an expansion, but it's a version of World of Warcraft, and a pretty huge one at that. Now, without a doubt, Vanilla has some amazing zones, but in that massive world it created, there are some which aren't quite as good. The pick for me, and I think this is just about the most basic pick for Vanilla, but it's that for a reason, is Desolus. I mean, come on, they made a massive flat grey bunch of nothing and said, wow, this place is so desolate. Why don't we just name it after that? Now, to be fair, Desolus is a fairly good leveling zone for both Horde and Alliance if you know how to navigate it and pick up all the quests where needed. And if you're using a questing guide, they're always going to send you here. The issues for me are, well, first of all, the appearance of the place, as I've already mentioned. It's not a very nice place to be for too long. Second is that it hits those levels just before you get a mount, so you have to run this whole place on foot. This means you get a really good opportunity to soak in the sights of Desolus, such as the Kodo Graveyard or the wildlife of the zone. Speaking of that, why is mob density so bizarrely high in some places, on top of having mobs which have crazy level ranges barely a few hundred yards apart? Oftentimes in Vanilla, I'll opt for a few dungeons instead of coming here, as it can be an optional zone if you want it to be, and I am thankful for that. Next up is another old expansion, in fact, the first expansion, the Burning Crusade. So I think for most people this is a close one between Hellfire Peninsula and Blade's Edge Mountain. I think out of the two zones, however, Hellfire Peninsula isn't as bad. It is the first zone you're coming into for the Burning Crusade, you start to upgrade your gear, maybe you do anyway, and there are dungeons which are great to do and easy to access as soon as you're there, and then afterwards you get to carry on into Zangarmarsh quite soon, which means for me my pick for TBC will go to Blade's Edge Mountains. One of the problems with TBC leveling is that it was always very linear, so on your regular playthrough you're going to have to experience the wonders of Blade's Edge Mountains, which means having to go up and down the valley in the centre several times in a row to hand in and complete some quests. There are several quests with weird items, especially from that gnome area, Alliance players will know, that aren't exactly intuitive to use, and whilst you're there you're not going to have flying yet either. All in all, this makes it a less than fun place to be. Fortunately, you don't have to finish the entire zone to be high enough level to progress onwards, but getting to Blade's Edge Mountain for me is always a short visit, which means the second to last entry is from Wrath of the Lich King. Wrath had some absolute banger zones. Howling Fjord, despite the incredibly annoying quests early on, still remains a favourite for me. Sholazar Basin is great, and of course the good old Grizzly Hills. And there's so many good zones that the ones which aren't as good really end up standing out. Fortunately though, by the time Wrath came out, there were more quests in zones than experience needed to level cap, so you could basically skip entire zones and be just fine. Oh, and we also had heirlooms and bonus XP effects, those help too. But the zone I'm talking about here for Wrath is Gundrak. Gundrak has one singular redeeming feature, and that is the Amphitheatre of Anguish. It's always fun to do, very worthwhile, loads of XP, great reward at the end, but it's just not enough by itself. Gundrak has a dark and gloomy atmosphere, mobs which are strangely just far enough away from one another to be inconvenient, but above all it has the Drakuru questline. This questline is the answer to the question, do you want to not play your character and do vehicle quests for the next 90 minutes? If yes, I have great news for you. I can't think of a single questline in this entire game which was worse to do. When doing Loremaster of Northrend, it was without a doubt the lowest point at leveling in the game for me, and for the majority of my characters in Wrath, I just did a few quests at the start of Gundrak which were well laid out, and then I'd only ever come back here for the dungeons. Which means in first place or last place, depending on how you're looking at it, is the zone where I really never want to go, and that is from the Shadowlands. And I bet you already know where I'm gonna pick. That's right, it's quite literally hell on Azeroth, the Moor. I mean, technically the Moor should be the last place anyone would want to be, so it being a terrible place is Blizzard having done a good job? With some of these other zones that I wasn't a fan of, sometimes you could skip them or you didn't really have to be there, they were just there for extra stuff that you could do within the game. This was not the case with the Moor, as it was directly tied to a number of progression points for your character, so you had to go to the Moor, and at the start you couldn't even mount. In fact, do you remember early on in Shadowlands, people would put war mode on just outside of Venari's refuge and gank people for the weekly quest, so Blizzard had to give everyone invisibility so you could actually get out into the zone. What a great start. But then you ventured out into this rather large zone on foot, and it wasn't the case that you couldn't fly, you straight up couldn't mount here at the start of the expansion. They added mounts sometime later in a patch though. There were all the hallmarks of inconvenience too: high mob density, verticality that could make getting across the zone difficult, and an all too fitting colour palette of black, grey and red. For what it was almost so bad it was good in a weird way, but the Moor was one of the reasons that I checked out of Shadowlands at a very early stage, and really, I don't think I missed much. Imagine it's patch day, you've read about the upcoming changes, maybe even got to watch some videos on it, and are hyped for the brand new addition to the World of Warcraft. MMOs tend to live off constant updates over time and offering their player bases new and fresh experiences. But sometimes not everything goes to plan. Sometimes it's due to the content in the patch not being what people expected, sometimes the ambitions of the developers were just too big, and sometimes things just go very wrong. And to be clear, it's not the case that all these updates were poorly received by the player base, though if they were it will certainly impact how they will be ranked. In fact, I'd say some of them are among the most famous updates ever, and people look back to them and say they were amazing moments. It's more that these all just completely broke the game in one way or another. So that's what I want to talk about today, those moments where testing was done in production, alarm bells would have been ringing at Blizzard headquarters, and for a short while the World of Warcraft ground to a halt. These are what I think were 10 of the most disastrous World of Warcraft updates of all time. Starting off, we have the final major content patch of Battle for Azeroth, patch 8.3, Visions of N'Zoth. BFA has gone down over time as being a highly controversial expansion where Blizzard leaned far too heavily into temporary power gains for our characters, and they also focused massively on daily, weekly, and even monthly chores which we had to do in order to stay up to speed with all these expansion-specific systems. Where we started out with just our Azerite armor, then later we had essences added into the mix in 8.2, and it just seemed as though there couldn't possibly be anything else. Well, that would turn out to be very wrong, as in 8.3 Blizzard will bring out arguably the most impactful temporary power gain system ever: corrupted gear. During this final patch, gear had a chance to become corrupted, meaning it could gain a random affix of a certain rank. Corruptions had 3 different ranks too, with 1 being the weakest version of that corruption and 3 the strongest. So to get a properly best in slot item was extremely unlikely. I mean, even getting your best corruption at rank 3 on a piece of gear that you were supposed to be using wasn't that common. And I say the gear you're supposed to be using very much on purpose. I remember watching some of the Race to World First in Nyalotha the Waking City, and some of the tanks had cloth gear on just because it had Abyss corruption on it, and the power gain from this corruption was so high that it was worth just not even using proper armor. And believe me, corruptions were a very big deal. It's not hard to find DPS meters from back in the day with randomly acquired effects on random bits of gear doing random uncontrolled damage, which contributed more than your entire normal rotation. Simply put, it was proc hell. Also during this patch, bind on equip gear with good corruptions became worth millions of gold, especially if you were on a realm with a highly competitive guild. Part of the Race to World First became how much gold can we launch at getting BIS BOE gear off of the auction house. I'm sure there are people watching this who got a random drop late in BFA and it set them for life for gold on World of Warcraft. To this day, corruptions remain the most impactful random effects on gear we've ever seen, and I don't think we're going to see that change anytime soon. The second big potential problem with this final patch of BFA was story-wise with the N'Zoth fight. N'Zoth have been built up over many years in the WoW universe as the controlling mastermind behind so many different events that had taken place. So when players got to face him, they were expecting an epic encounter. And whilst the fight itself might have been good enough for you, what wasn't good enough for many people was how the boss actually went out. A short cutscene where the player channels a beam into the boss, and then another short cutscene where the boss, explodes, and people complain they didn't get to fight Deathwing in Cataclysm, but this one was on a whole other level. Blizzard even had this video on their official channel for a while, but they ended up unlisting it, meaning you need the link to watch it because it was so poorly received by the community. And then after this, we didn't even know Shadowlands was due to be the next WoW installment. 8.3 will always be a memorable patch, and there was no doubt some fun to be had by just how dumb overpowered corruptions were, and I know a lot of people did like the patch for this reason, as well as the other catch-up systems. But then the Zoth cutscene, definitely I don't think is one to remember, so all in all I think 8.3 deserves a mention on this list. Next up is a patch from the expansion following BFA, the Shadowlands. I don't think it's too much of a surprise to see these two expansions getting a mention during this video, but don't worry, there's definitely going to be a lot of variety, I can tell you that. The patch I'm picking from Shadowlands is the first major content patch, 9.1 Chains of Domination. Following a rough start, Shadowlands was in need of a good first patch to turn things around and win players back to this expansion. 9.1, however, was not going to be that patch. The first thing players got to see in 9.1 was Korthia City of Secrets, which to be honest was rather short on the city part of its name and the secret part too. Instead of a mystical sprawling city or library, it was kind of a rather inconvenient to traverse zone with loads of random stuff to pick up. And there was about half a dozen new currencies or something, because Blizzard loves some new currencies in a major patch. Korthia City of Secrets just missed the mark on expectations and ended up just feeling a bit bland and forgettable. In 9.1, Blizzard were also still standing strong on their stance with Covenant, which had been a controversial addition to the game made through Shadowlands. At the start of Shadowlands, you could only pick one Covenant, which would give you certain new abilities, and sometimes these abilities were bis for PvP or PvE or even Mythic Plus, and swapping these Covenants was an extremely lengthy process where basically it just wasn't viable to do unless you were really committed to doing so. The problem was that when players were locked into one Covenant, they were at times missing a vital class ability and just couldn't go and get it, so you were going to perform worse than somebody else of the same class who had picked a better Covenant in a certain area of the game, and people just did not like that at all. In patch 9.1.5, Blizzard would finally cave on this and make Covenant swappable, but it really didn't help the situation in Shadowlands that they didn't want to budge on this for so long. On top of that, the story of Shadowlands heading into its second raid tier, the Sanctum of Domination, was not being that well received either, with Sylvanas and her infinite power trip still being well underway. It's probably one of the moments in WoW's history with some of the highest player dissatisfaction towards the state of the game. It's rare that the new zone, the new story, and the new raid don't go down all that well. It's almost impressive in a way. 9.1 did have Tazavesh, the Veiled Market, as a redeeming moment, but I don't think that was quite enough to salvage the patch as a whole. Next up, we're going all the way back to TBC for a rather less than memorable patch. The super early versions of World of Warcraft tend to get away with having some major content patches that were absolutely dire in retrospect. I guess the World of Warcraft just seemed a whole lot bigger when we all knew a whole lot less about it, but that's not something we can change now. But the patch I want to highlight here is patch 2.2, Voice Chat. You see, TBC was an extremely front-loaded expansion which had all of its dungeons, minus Magister's Terrace, as well as their heroic difficulties, and raiding-wise it had Karazhan, Grul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep, and Mount Hyjal at launch. Patch 2.1 came along and nerfed pretty much all of that content and brought in the Black Temple, so by patch 2.2, I guess it kind of makes sense that things had slowed down a bit after that insane pace at launch. But what 2.2 brought into the game was voice chat. And I mean, in terms of new content for a major patch, that was basically it. The rest of the patch was rebalancing existing stuff and bug fixes. Imagine a major patch nowadays and it's a singular feature which isn't even any in-game content. Of course, at the time, voice chat options were a lot more limited than Discord, which we're also used to nowadays, so having a good in-game voice chat feature would have been legitimately useful. It is rather a shame then that the voice chat they delivered was bad, like really bad. Poor voice quality, disconnections, and implementation issues in-game meant that the player base never adopted this new system as something that was commonly used, and most people just carried on using Ventrilo as the go-to. Blizzard were even asked about the quality of the voice chat in a dev blog, where they basically said, yeah, it's bad, we need to make it better, and that they'd work on it later. To be honest, I'm not sure if they ever did, because I don't think I've ever met somebody who hasn't used some kind of third-party voice chat chat between one event, Skype, Mumble or Discord, but an entire major patch to be one new feature which didn't even work properly seems pretty bad to me. So that's why patch 2.2 voice chat gets a mention here. Speaking of hey Blizz, where's the content type of patches? Let me introduce you to the first major content patch of Warlords of Draenor, patch 6.1 Garrisons Update. A major patch which was comprised of, are you ready for this? Are you sitting down? It had new Blood Elf models, an Heirloom Collection tab, Twitter integration, and a selfie cam. And that is kind of it. Yeah. So, Warlords of Draenor didn't get off to a good start, more on that later, don't worry, and it was also during 6.1 alongside the fastest subscriber drop-off WoW has ever seen, that Blizzard decided there were better metrics to measure the game's performance by rather than making this information public. Or in other words, saying our game's doing bad isn't good for shareholders. Let's not do that anymore. In fact, Warlords of Draenor was so sparse on content that the second major raid tier in Blackrock Foundry was released about 1 month or so prior to 6.1. I don't know if there's ever been another major raid just dropped in between patches ever, and 6.2 with Hellfire Citadel and Tanaan Jungle was the last major content patch, by the way. It's hard to look back and believe just how little Warlords of Draenor had going on content-wise, but 6.1 was the peak of the lack of the new stuff to do in WoW. This was of course on top of all the content that was cancelled for WoD, such as the Zangarmarsh zone, the Netherstorm zone aka Farallon, Karabor, which would become the Black Temple being the capital for the Alliance, and so much more. It must have been difficult as a Blizzard developer to see this patch going live, knowing how people would react to it, and it surely marks a low point in the history of World of Warcraft, and for that reason it's making the list here. Next up, we're going back just a little bit more to visit our current classic expansion, Cataclysm. Whilst as a whole Cata generally receives a mixed reception, if there was one patch that people like the least, it will be the final one, patch 4.3, the Hour of Twilight. This was the culmination of the Cataclysm expansion and would finally see us do battle with Deathwing, who had been taunting us for the entire expansion. But similar to 8.3 and with Visions of N'Zoth, when we finally did battle, it just wasn't quite right. The two-part encounter with Deathwing sounds epic on paper, with us jumping from an airship onto his back to destroy his armor, and then finally defeating him once and for all after he crashes into the Maelstrom. But in practice, many people felt as though they never properly fought Deathwing as the big final bad guy of the expansion, and ultimately it just wasn't a satisfying end to the story. This patch also introduced LFR, and Cata looking for raid was kinda built different. Even though it was designed to be an easier and accessible version of raiding, for a lot of people it was their first step into this type of content, and the differing levels of player skill you'd see more or less instantly led to a very toxic raid environment. Also, unlike future versions of LFR, there was no determination stacking, you know, that 5% buff you get when you wipe on something, so you just have to repeat and wipe until the boss died. But of course, if you wipe or it wasn't close to a kill, you get a bunch of people who leave, and then you have to wait for new people to get in and hope that they have some kind of idea what to do on the boss so you could progress. Spoiler alert, they were never any better. It was just a rotating door of random people until you brute forced your way through the raid, which is why I've always found LFR to be a poor substitute for normal organized raiding. But the loot from LFR was still very good, especially weapons, trinkets and tier sets, so you had to go and get it done to aid your guild in progression. Even Paragon, who had earned every world first from Heroic Lich King to Ragnaros, got hit with a ban. They found a loophole where you could see what a boss dropped but not loot it if it's not what you wanted, and then go kill it again and repeat until you get your desired item. I think looking for raid has definitely grown in popularity over time and has improved in terms of balance, as well as being separated from raid releases, but the first iteration of it in Cata was really not that good. And it's funny that Blizzard are delaying LFR in Cata Classic. Maybe they took a look at how it was back then and thought, yeah, we're not putting this back in the game anytime soon, we need to come up with a better idea. Saying this, patch 4.3 definitely had some good content too, such as the 3 new dungeons it introduced, and of course transmogrification, which is probably one of the most single impactful additions to WoW ever. So patch 4.3 in the Hour of Twilight wasn't all good, but it definitely wasn't the best either. Next up is the first expansion launch to take place on this list. Over the years, Blizzard have definitely learned a thing or two about how to get World of Warcraft's massive player base from one expansion over to the next, and these days it tends to be pretty seamless. You log in, a new NPC appears, you talk to them, and that's it, you're in the a new expansion. Easy. Back in the day, things were different. See, World of Warcraft had done rather well as a game. I don't think anyone would have guessed by the time its first expansion launched that there would be some 8 million active subscribers. And that means you have up to 8 million people to get from the Blasted Lands through the Dark Portal and into the Burning Crusade. Enter patch 2.0.3, simply titled The Burning Crusade. The player bottleneck this created was absolutely massive. World of Warcraft had been successful beyond belief. So upon midnight releases across the world, people queued in their often cold January weather at their local game shop to pick up a copy of World of Warcraft's first expansion. Getting home with supplies to play for the whole weekend, you installed the several discs, you logged in, and then it hit you. Your entire server, Horde and Alliance were in the Blasted Lands. This was in the days before layering or sharding or any technology to separate players up artificially. If there were 1,000 players in a zone, there were 1,000 players in a zone. You'd have been lucky to have anything better than a single digit of FPS. The game lagged behind incredibly, of course, and PvP servers were a thing, don't forget. You'd have had people ganking others trying to get through the portal. It was definitely a legendary moment to have been there, but it was also a bit of a learning point for Blizzard. Don't send all your players through the same gate at the same time, which is why in expansions like Wrath, for example, you could start in the Borean Tundra or Howling Fjord, Cataclysm, Vashj'ir or Hyjal, Pandaria opposite ends of the Jade Forest. Horde and Alliance were also split too when they accessed these new zones. Once you were through the portal, things settled down rather fast as the player base spread out again. But for a moment, all 8 million WoW players were stuck getting through that dark portal. But the launch of an expansion pales before some of the things that Blizzard attempted to do in vanilla. Perhaps one of the most ambitious events to ever have taken place in World of Warcraft happened just after the release of patch 1.9, the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. Now, unlike many of the patches we've gone over so far, the drama surrounding this patch didn't happen more or less straight away, but sometime after. Nowadays, a lot of people have played through and experienced what made opening the Gates of AQ such an epic event, and I guess you can only imagine the tasks set before players back in January of 2006. To open the gates, two main things need to happen. A player has to undergo a huge quest chain to obtain the Scepter of the Shifting Sands, and secondly, the war effort has to be completed, where literally millions of items must be handed in across both Horde and Alliance. Once the war effort part is done, there was a few days grace where story-wise the items were being transported over to Silithus, and after that any player with the Scepter was eligible to sound the gong outside of AQ on their server and to start the 10-hour war. Whilst these two parts leading up to the 10-hour war are epic in their own right, this event is what truly broke servers. So when the war effort was done, you had the Scepter and you bang the gong, the AQ event will begin on your server specifically, and defenders would pour out to attack any player characters awaiting outside. This spawned in tons of elite enemies, and so many players and mobs clashed in battle, the servers absolutely could not handle it. We've already talked about how back then they didn't have any tech to split players up when there was a lot of them in the same zone, and this was very much the same situation. And you better believe everyone on your server during those 10 hours were logged in and in Silithus doing battle with the Anubisaf, Silithid and other defenders of AQ. People would report having the game crash and logging back in to find themselves in Westfall Graveyard bizarrely, or even in the Stone Talon Mountains. These were some suspected failsafe respawn points within the game. What the developers tried to do here retrospectively was just absolutely crazy, and there was no way it was ever going to work well, and you have to respect them for taking that step and creating something truly memorable. Re-experiencing the opening of AQ on Classic Realms was once again something to behold, and even with our layering tech these days, the servers still absolutely couldn't handle it. So I guess in that sense, we did get to enjoy the authentic Classic experience. The opening of the Gates of AQ were a unique moment in World of Warcraft's history, and not something to soon be repeated. It was so ambitious in scale, the game simply couldn't handle it, and that remained true some 20 years later, and that's why it's making this video. Next up, we have something a bit more modern. In fact, this is the most recent patch to World of Warcraft in this entire list. So far, we've seen game updates that broke the game for both the right and the wrong reasons, but this is entirely something else. This is the unnamed patch 1.15.2 of Season of Discovery, aka SOD Phase 3. So, Season of Discovery got off to an incredible start. I don't really think you can argue with that. Vanilla with class updates, new content, new stuff to find, sounds great, sign me right up. Spamming the Black Fathoms Deep raid, checking out all the runes, getting every class to 25, it was a really great time. Then Phase 2 came about and it was okay. An updated Gnomeregan, that's not everyone's favourite dungeon, and some of these runes are starting to take a while to get. So Phase 3 had some work to do to get players reinvested in this fresh vanilla experience. And one of the key new pieces of content in Phase 3 would be Nightmare Incursions, a PvE themed event where you fight off forces of the Nightmare and earn various rewards. The first red flag came in advance of the patch dropping when we heard that Nightmare Invasions had taken inspiration from the Cenarian Hold Rat farm in Silithus. Now vanilla did many things right, but some things such as the old ranking system or the, Cenarian Hold Rat farm were not things I could get behind doing again. And then the content came out for Nightmare Incursions and, well, where do I start? People who played the launch of Phase 3 racked up hundreds of gold in a matter of a few hours, as the rewards for these short repeatable quests were just far too good. People logged in the morning when it had already been nerfed and felt cheated out of tons of gold, and gold still mattered big time in vanilla, so this was already a poor start to this new event. Nightmare Incursions also blew every single other way of leveling out of the water. Nothing else felt worth doing. It also introduced new very well itemized gear, or at least very well itemized if you didn't do too much BFD, and these items were great for every class and spec. The mob density in the incursions was insane, and it was difficult to make your way through without getting dazed. There were these mobs that will wait until you cast a spell and then spell lock you. If you think about it, you'll notice how Blizzard pretty much never puts ranged interrupts on enemies for exactly this reason. The Cenarian Hold folder system for obtaining quests was incredibly clunky and user unfriendly. Add-ons and weak auras were quickly developed to auto-delete bad quests and share the good ones though. Only one group per layer could start the escort quests, and the entire rest of the server on that layer had to go an AFK by the end of the ramp for them to hand in so they could get quest credit. Who thought this up? Some mobs just hit unreasonably hard and would make Defias pillagers even look weak in comparison. There were wisps that would chase you down and dismount you in addition to doing about a third of your health. The list just goes on and on and on. At least there weren't mob tags on named elites though. Maybe that's the one redeeming feature I can think of. But the launch of Phase 3 and Incursions were honestly a bit of a disaster for Season of Discovery, despite it more recently improving a lot with Karazhan, the Rune Vendor and so on. But Phase 3 of Season of Discovery is definitely worthy of third place here. At the number 2 spot we're staying in a vanilla setting for perhaps one of the most well-known events in WoW history. So well known it's even made the news in real life. This took place during patch 1.7, Rise of the Blood God. Little did they know how true this patch name would end up being. On September 13th, a brand new raid was introduced, Zul'Gurub, and during the final boss, Hakar, he casts an ability called Corrupted Blood. This does damage over time to the affected player as well as a small AoE around them, and most importantly, if that player stands too close to somebody else, they will also get this debuff. The idea of this is in the fight you need to be careful with your positioning and making sure that the afflicted player is practicing some good old social distancing. But what happened when ZG first released is that Corrupted Blood would also affect pets. So if a pet got the debuff and was dismissed, it would retain that debuff until re-summoned. So the idea then is pretty simple. Go Hakar, get debuff on pet, dismiss pet, go to super high populated area such as vendors during holiday events, the auction house and so on, re-summon your pet and watch as the Corrupted Blood spreads like wildfire to all nearby players and NPCs in a matter of seconds. And once the debuff was out there, it was kind of impossible to get rid of it. Accidentally or on purpose, players would be spreading it about, and again NPCs could get it too. Those wandering guards in capital cities started to become plague spreaders. Things got so impossibly out of hand due to this debuff making populated zones impossible to traverse that Blizzard had to do a hard reset on all servers to clear the remaining debuffs. And Blizzard, outside of maintenance, really never do this. This debuff and its spread was even used as research on the effect of real-world epidemics, such was its impact within the game. The Corrupted Blood incident is without a doubt one of the most famous moments in all of WoW history, and when it comes to something going very wrong, it's kind of hard to beat. But there is one patch which absolutely clears everything else in terms of how wrong it went. One defining moment. There has never been a more utterly disastrous patch in World of Warcraft than 6.0.3a Warlords of Draenor. This was the release patch for Warlords of Draenor, WoW's 5th expansion, and seemingly a return to more traditional WoW values of big orcs and killing demons. A huge part of this expansion, and something that every player had to undergo as their entry to Draenor, was the introduction to their garrison. A kind of player housing type thing where the player had their own base and was able to build it up, recruit followers, do missions and so on. And this is where the issues started to happen. The sheer volume of players returning for WoD hyped off the intro cinematic was insane, and Blizzard just weren't ready for this number of players to try and access the game all at the same time. Blizzard also commented on DDoS attacks happening at the same time as the launch, which are of course out of their control but will always massively impact the game. But at the end of the day, when there's a fresh expansion in front of you and the game just won't load, it's always going to be frustrating. Tons of people also got bottlenecked in their garrisons as part of the introductory quest. And with each and every player having their own instance version of the world active, I think you can imagine why this could have caused problems, with literally millions of instances being created in the space of a few hours. It wasn't uncommon for some players to be legitimately stuck for several days in a row at the start of Warlords of Draenor. They were unable to log in, unable to use any unstuck function, and your time off work or school was wasted just so you could look at a login screen. It was by far the worst expansion launch this game has ever seen, and between the DDoS attacks and other issues preventing players from getting into the game, I don't think a scenario like this could really happen again on this scale. I do also know a lot of people didn't have the same issues during WoD launch and got straight in, but in terms of impact for the affected players, I don't think anything has gone more wrong than this for more players, and that's why the launch of Warlords of Draenor for me has to be the most disastrous patch in World of Warcraft's history. Getting into PvP in Wrath Classic is easy. You do some PvP, you earn honor, you go buy gear, and that is it. Job done. But it wasn't always quite so simple. I did a video recently with a throwback to all the effort that went into world buffs, and it seems to me like a lot of people are either new to Wrath or enjoyed remembering them. It got me thinking about another core feature of vanilla, which has never been recreated in any version of World of Warcraft since. Releasing early on into Classic, this system followed true to how it was originally implemented, and it was the start of what was, without a single doubt for me, the most try-hard and sweaty 2 months that Classic WoW has or ever will see. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the honor and ranking PvP system of Classic WoW. So first question, why rank? Why get into this? Why is it such a big deal? Well, the gear is really good. Ranks 7, 8 and 10 gave blue quality gear, which also had tier set bonuses tied to them that made them even better. Ranks 12 and 13 gave epic armor, and 14 gave weapons. These items were best in slot for months, in some cases for the entire game. The gear was absolutely amazing for all specs and classes, and for vanilla was very well itemized as well. It was also a guaranteed source of loot. Remember, vanilla had 40-man raids and bosses dropped about 4 or so items. Being on that wait list for your bis could take a very long time, especially when you're one of your guild's 10 warriors, which isn't really an exaggeration either. And finally, perhaps the biggest reason overall why it was so sweaty is because it was winter 2019, peak COVID, and you were probably working from home. The term COVID ranker was often used. Remember, in Wrath, it's just PvP, you get honor, buy gear. That's quite literally it. It doesn't need to be explained any further than that. Back in Classic, it was a little bit more complicated, shall we say. So essentially, you go do PvP, your open world, your battlegrounds, objectives, capping flags, and so on and so forth, and you earn honor. At the end of the week, on a server by server basis, this is important, the game checks who has earned the most honor and then awards ranking points based upon that. The player with the most honor of that week will earn a maximum of around 13,000 ranking points, with all other players in the PvP pool earning gradually less RP or ranking points corresponding to how much honor they farmed. And you needed a minimum of 15 honorable kills a week to be part of that week's PvP pool. This will be relevant later. Your total RP determines your rank. So this will be the visible title you have. So rank 6 is Knight for Alliance, and rank 9 is Centurion for Horde, and so on. Your rank is also what permits you to access PvP rewards. Rank 11 gives mounts, rank 12 and 13 the epic armor, and so on. All of these rewards are bought for gold, by the way. Honor is just a resource used to calculate calculate RP, not a currency. To achieve rank 14, the highest possible rank, you needed a total of 60k ranking points. And as you can earn around 13,000 per week maximum, it doesn't sound all too bad of a grind, right? Well, actually no, that would be quite wrong. You see, you lose 20% of your RP each week. This is called decay, and decay is the real kicker in this system, because as your rank goes up, your RP total does too, and you keep losing more and more each week. So once you start ranking with a goal rank in mind, you can't stop, or decay will wipe out potentially weeks worth of progression with this system. You can't have a week off ranking, you can't miss a day, you can't abandon the grind, or it will all have been for nothing. And yes, you can lose ranks through decay. In fact, in the final weeks from 13 to 14, your RP earnings will only be a little higher than the decay of your overall rank. And when I say 13,000 RP is the maximum earned, you have to be in the top 0.2% of the players for honor games that week to be around that level. It used to be 0.1% too, but believe it or not, we had the more lenient version of classic ranking. So being, for example, in the top 2% of honor gained for that week would not have been good enough to reach rank 14. Your decay would be too high and it would not be possible. You had to be right at the top, grinding for hours and hours every day. On top of that, each rank advancement, as you can see here, is 5k RP over the last one. This means if you miss out on some grind, you could very much end up at, for example, rank 13, 95% progress, meaning despite only being 5% off your goal, you had to go and grind honor for another over 12 hours a day for a whole week in order to beat decay. And when I say 12 hours a day, that's casual talk, and I'm being totally serious. The hours required to invest in ranking was absolutely obscene. It was more than a game, it was more than a job. It was living and breathing for several months on Discord with other people insane enough to do this. And the likes of Discord and real-life communication were totally key to ranking. Early on in Classic, you had to play ball to get ranks. If you didn't know the right people, you just weren't going to get a high rank. That was it. Remember, all this ranking stuff is server specific. The top honor earners will get the most RP, and the most RP gets you your rank the fastest. Do you see where this is going yet? So on each server, people began creating honor caps, or began to talk about being capped for the week. Now, there was no cap to how much honor you could gain in each week, of course. You could farm as much as you wanted, but people, well, didn't want to PvP more than they had to. And the term PvP being used for ranking was, yeah, it was farming, pure and simple. PvP was the side event. It was all about the grind. More on that later. Now, you needed to set the honor cap high enough when no casual player could possibly have any effect on it, nor could anyone not part of the ranking group realistically have a chance to farm enough to disrupt it. This varied server to server. Early on during my time on Gehennas, which was without a doubt the sweatiest European server, the launch caps when Battlegrounds finally came out were in excess of 1.5 million honor gained in the space of a week. You got a couple thousand per battleground, by the way. The second thing setting a cap to honor did was allowing people to bracket stack. As ranking point awards, remember, are done off a percentage of total players within the pool. You wanted as many people as possible to be as close together as possible to min-max your RP earnings. This system was good when everyone worked together and stuck to the amount of honor they were assigned to farm. Yes, people were assigned a number of honor to farm in a week. But what if somebody went a bit rogue towards the end of the week and began to PvP more and gained extra honor? That was a big no-no. We don't want to PvP, remember, we want to earn ranking points. Doing this was called bracket breaking and was one of the most potentially dramatic things you could do in a ranking environment. Accidental or otherwise, and you bet people did this on purpose, after PvPing for 16 to 18 hours a day for months, yes, it was months to get rank 14, a lot of people went over the edge a bit, shall we say. Anyways, by raising the honor cap, you could easily throw off the calculations for the week, as it was a matter of tenths of a percentage. It was very easy to do, especially at the top of the bracket. It literally gained you nothing as you were already among the top earners, whilst also more or less ensuring that everyone else at the top just got another week of 16-hour battlegrounds added to their life. If there was ever a way to get back at someone though, this was it. So yeah, pretty simple system so far. Can't see why they ended up changing it to just go earn honor and buy gear. But wait, There's a lot more actually. This is where we need to talk about the PvP pool. This is the total number of players who have gained 15 or more honorable kills in a week. Now, of course, ranking point gains are done from a percentage of the total players in the PvP pool, and we know that players were trying to stack the bracket to min-max their gains here. In fact, on smaller servers, sometimes the PvP pool was not large enough to award the highest amount of RP gains, and you literally could not get rank 14 because decay was too high. Ideally though, you wanted the PvP pool to be as large as possible. More participants opened up new slots at the top end for people to earn more RP, and as far as I remember, adding around 330 extra characters to the PvP pool added an extra bracket 1 spot. So how do you convince 330-ish people to go and get 15 honorable kills? Well, you could always just do it yourself. People really tryharding ranking would organize pool boosting. This involved creating level 1 characters, running them to the nearest graveyard, and having them farm an enemy faction character 15 times over. When they have 15 honorable kills, you delete the character, you run a new one over, and you repeat. Yes, deleted characters did count towards the PvP pool, and yes, people really did this a lot. In fact, people ended up botting it. There are some pretty insane clips out there back from Classic of dwarves gracefully flying out of the starting zone to do some good old-fashioned pool boosting. And I've just realized I haven't even mentioned what an honorable kill is yet either. How did I make it this far? It's simple. Any character within a range of 12 levels of you will grant honor, increased by their rank, decreased by how many times they've been farmed on that particular day. This meant as a level 60, it's very honorable to go and delete a level 48 from existence for some of those sweet honor points. But there are dishonorable kills too. You have to be really careful about these. There are NPCs throughout the game who are marked as civilians. Killing these will instantly lower your rank. This was added more or less just to stop griefing and people camping NPCs, and dishonorable kills lowered your rank fast, and I mean fast. You could wipe out months worth of 16-hour days in about 2 hours or so. This meant when you were ranking, you actually didn't want to go anywhere near a place that had NPCs marked as civilian just in case it happened somehow. You could even get dishonorable kills as part of a group too without actually having done anything yourself. But when ranking launched, you kinda had to take the fight to the opposite faction. See, back in original vanilla, when this PvP system launched, it did so without any battlegrounds being available, and in Classic, yep, we went ahead and did the exact same thing. No changes. So we're talking about a PvP system which actively encourages playing for over 12 hours a day, grouping up into pre-mades, ganking lobbies at the peak of COVID and working from home, combined with a generation of gamers who missed the boat on rank 14 the first time around. And what you get out of that? You get Phase 2 Classic World of Warcraft PvP. World PvP. And oh boy, was it definitely one of the most things that happened during Classic. Credit where it's due here, Terra Mill versus South Shore for a couple of days was actually a lot of fun, but it quickly descended into camping and farming lower level characters, and you better hope you were level capped if you were on a PvP server, because leveling was just off limits now. If you were a faction minority on a server, this was even worse. Remember, if you're level 48 or above, you give honor. There were ganking trains from Thorium Point to Blackrock Mountain, littered with the bodies of the poor unfortunates who made up the faction minority on their server. Any end game zone was now an honor farming zone. One time on a journey from Feathermoon Stronghold to Diamond East on my Warlock, I died a total of 9 times. It's like driving down a highway and you get stopped to pay a toll every few hundred meters, except the toll was, without exception, either an orc warrior with a shaman or an undead rogue and priest, waiting to claim their 198 honor. Split 2 ways, of course. Transport between continents was off limits too. Horde controlled the seas like a bunch of pirates, but Alliance couldn't farm on the Horde Zeppelins because obviously Horde transport had guards and Alliance ships didn't. Blizzard, thanks for that. Even faction capitals were not safe. You had to farm harder and longer if you wanted to rank up. It wasn't a choice. Rogues would roam the streets of Ironforge looking to pick off those who strayed too far from the guards, and mages would res, palm pyro some poor unfortunate undergear lobby and then die themselves and run back. And they did this all day, every day, for weeks. Some servers saw their faction totally die off during this phase of the game as the ganking was so unrelenting. And so eventually, earlier than expected, Blizzard brought Battlegrounds back to Classic. The first two we had were Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley. Now initially Warsong just wasn't played at all. Why? Bad honor per hour, of course. Keep your eyes on the goal, we're not here to have fun. Alterac Valley, or AV, however, presented the best honor per hour in the game, and you know how people played AV back in Classic? A battleground that had a legacy of games lasting for hours and hours or even days, and a constant tug of war back between the Horde and the Alliance. They ran straight past each other down to the enemy general in a bid to finish the map the fastest. The best honor per hour was running down Alterac Valley for 16 hours a day doing PvE, and I'm not exaggerating. And players had honor farming min-maxed down to a T. So interestingly, here was where the Alliance did have a benefit over the Horde. Many more PvP oriented players went Horde due to the fact they had some really busted racials back then, such as Will of the Forsaken or Hardiness. But when it came to joining a queue for Battlegrounds, the Horde were nearly always waiting. Even an Alterac Valley at launch was a good 20 minutes or so, and later on into the expansion, it was legitimately hours of waiting. Alliance pressed join Battleground and the queue popped up instantly every single time. Now back then, if you remember, Battlegrounds had a number assigned to them, and you could see on your pop-up which Battleground number you had received. And whilst you couldn't just full on queue as a 40-man for Alterac Valley, you could game the system into essentially guaranteeing that you're going to win. Get ready for this one. So what players did is they had a ranking Discord server. As we went over earlier, communication between players is key to getting the most out of your ranking. What would happen is that a bot on Discord would count down for everybody to press join Battleground at the same time. After a few seconds, everyone posts what Battleground number they've received in the Discord chat. The bot would then tally up how many instances of each Battleground had been entered. So if you only got 5 people with the same Battleground number, that's no good. Drop that queue, rejoin the next countdown and try again. Of course, you don't get any punishment for dropping the queue. However, if you, for example, got 25 people in the same Alterac Valley, this happened regularly by the way, everyone presses join and you have an AV with over half your team on comms with some of the best gear available, rocking consumables, and of course having engineering. The Horde just didn't have even a remote chance when they ran into a pre-made like this, and they often had to wait close to an hour for Alterac Valleys which could finish in, again no exaggeration, as little as 8 minutes. Oh, and the Horde had to resort to joining an AV queue, flying over to Eastern Plaguelands to gank low-level Alliance players, finally getting a Battleground queue, you play it out, your BG ends, it puts you back to where you join the BG, you rejoin, and then you fly back to EPL. People used Undercity because it was closest to an endgame level zone. Sounds like fun, right? Later on, Blizzard removed the ability to see a Battleground number in queue, but players found ways around it though, and kept pre-mades going right up to the end of Classic. I could do a whole video on the shifting Alterac Valley meta, but yeah, it was pretty sweaty to say the least. Warsong Gulch also got min-maxed into misery for the solo player. First up, you could straight up pre-made a 10-man group into Warsong Gulch. But what if you ran into another pre-made? That's going to be an uphill battle. Remember, we want honor points, not PvP. So what players did is have a scout as part of their group join the battleground and see what the enemy team was made up of. If the scoreboard showed loads of enemies from the same realm, you kind of know already that it's a pre-made. And Horde at this point still had queues, remember, they couldn't do this unless they wanted to get back in line after abandoning the BG. So Alliance players would drop the queue, they'd get a new scout in, the old one would have the deserter debuff as they did leave a battleground. The rest of the raid wouldn't get any deserter debuff of course because they never actually joined the battleground. They queue again until they get a bunch of solo players where they can quite happily farm them until the victims realize it's not worth resurrecting anymore, and the optimal way to play the game is to semi-AFK as a ghost until they cap the 3rd flag. Oh, also Warsong Gulch had no in-game timer, they can go on forever. Some games were held hostage for literally over 12 hours. And there used to be exit portals inside Warsong Gulch too. They're the buildings kind of behind where the graveyards are, if you know what I mean. These were removed too as people were mind controlling enemy faction members and running them out of the battleground. This actually worked and it gave them a deserter debuff, which is kind of funny, but that's how Classic works sometimes. In time though, the Gen 1, yes they called themselves that, rankers hit 14 and things gradually began to get a little less sweaty overall. Classic does get a bit of a reputation for having people who take things to a pretty extreme degree when they just don't even remotely require it. I think world buffs were a good example of that when it came to raiding. Ranking, however, was one of those occasions where the players were very much in control of the levels of sweat that would be required, and they absolutely maxed that stat out. It was up to your server to determine the honor caps, how willing to group you were in order to earn honor, and how many hours you could run down Alterac Valley or run over unorganized pugs in Warsong Gulch and later Arathi Basin. And that's why the launch of the honor and ranking system in Phase 2 of Classic was and always will be the 2 sweatiest gamer months this game will ever see. For some, this will have been a trip down memory lane. For others, probably a feeling of relief that you didn't go full in on vanilla PvP ranking. It was certainly something, and I heard many times that after hitting rank 14, after literally months of playing all day every day with the same people, it was a bit of a strange feeling that eventually it had come to an end. But what ranking was memorable, and it created stories. Vanilla, for all its flaws, has always been very good at doing this, and that's why to this day people look back to how WoW started fondly. The universe and classes of vanilla World of Warcraft were made a long time before information was so widely shared on the internet, before guides, BIS lists, min-maxing or anything like that was nearly as commonplace. These things have definitely started to happen more over the course of its duration, especially during Classic and beyond, but originally it was all about the game, the classes, and the world. The developers were just a bunch of guys putting stuff in this massive universe that they thought would be cool or appealing to players. No worries about whether something would get too degenerate or whether the grind would be too long. It was truly a different time, and from the alpha to the beta to the release of World of Warcraft, the classes we all know so well underwent a ton of changes, with new abilities being added and other ones removed. And nowadays on our standard patch 1.12 version of vanilla that we're used to, we very much know what to expect. Who does the most damage, who levels the fastest, who farms gold the best, and so on. And though classes have so many cool and unique abilities, or even ones which are just for fun, such as Eyes of the Beast, there are also some rather questionable things which still exist in this version of the game. Those abilities, whether you have to consider whether you're actually going to be buying them from your class trainer, or the talents which you've probably never taken unless you've misclicked them somehow. Those are the things that I want to go over today. What for me have to be 10 of either the worst class abilities or talents that exist in vanilla World of Warcraft. We'll start with some not so bad ones, but things which are hard to find a use with, and then we'll finish on some abilities or talents which I'm not honestly sure how they still exist in the state they're in. I've also tried to pick things from as many different classes as possible where I think they're fair choices. So with all that said, let's make a start. First up, I have what will be the only entry that I thought I could include from the warrior on this list, since the warrior's toolkit in general is pretty good. I was close to picking Rend here, but it does get some use in the early game, and it can stop rogues from re-stealthing in PvP, so it does have some niche uses. It's a talent I want to pick for the warrior though, and one which feels unfortunately misplaced, so it's difficult to invest your points in it when you can pick other weapon types, and I'm talking about polearm specialization. The problem with this talent is how low down it is on the arms tree. See, for the other weapon types you can start putting points into them after having spent a total of 20 points in the talent tree, so you can get the rest of the best talents in the arms tree and then begin spending the rest on Fury. However, with polearm specialization, you need a minimum of 25 points in the arms tree before you can start leveling it, and that just makes it super awkward to fit into any build which I'd feel good about running. On top of that, there are a few other, let's say, meta problems which add to this talent rarely being taken, such as humans preferring maces or swords, and orcs axes for their racial weapon skill bonuses, and these bonuses are still nice even at a leveling phase of the game when fighting enemies who are a higher level than you. And then of course there are options such as Whirlwind Axe or Bonebiter which kind of dominate the mid-game portion of WoW. There isn't even a lack of good polearms in the game either if you look what's available. It just feels hard to get good use out of them. In the Burning Crusade, Blizzard combined polearm spec with axe spec into the creatively named Poleaxe specialization, which just increases your crit chance by 5% with either weapon equipped. And perhaps if this happened in vanilla, you wouldn't feel so bad about committing to going polearm on a warrior. Either way, due to poor talent placement and people generally favouring other weapon types, polearm spec gets the 10th spot here. Next up for you, I have the addition from the Shaman. Now, Shaman has some abilities which don't really see all that much use. For real, how often have you ever used Frostbrand Weapon or Flame Tongue Totem, for example? Probably not all that often. But there is one ability which I'm not even convinced that I've seen anyone get any good use out of it, and that is Wind Wall Totem. As one of your air totems, Wind Wall blocks a certain amount of damage from a ranged attack specifically. Not melee, not any form of magic, literally just ranged attacks. Now, Shaman's other damage mitigation totems such as Stone Skin and especially the elemental resistance totems are really good, so I guess Blizzard thought they would make something to mitigate ranged damage too to round out the toolkit, but I just don't know what you're supposed to do with this. The first problem it has is that it's an air totem. Do you know what else is an air totem? Wind Fury. And practically anytime you are grouped with a Shaman ever, you'll be wanting to drop Wind Fury because it's such a massive DPS gain. The second thing is that totem ranges are a bit iffy at times. They're not always where you expect them to be, and if you drop this in range of whatever's shooting at you, you may end up just getting close enough to be in melee range a few seconds later, which rather defeats the point of using Windwall Totem and spending mana on it. So really, the ideal scenario for Windwall Totem is you need to be being attacked from range but unable to close the gap fast, you don't need to swap to Wind Fury, and, well, ideally the ranged attackers aren't doing all that much damage because Windwall blocks a flat amount of damage, so it really doesn't do anything against heavy hitters. So do you have any ideas where this would be useful? Perhaps the only place I can think of is Cannon Master Willie, cool name that guy, the boss with the cannon in Strat Living. He calls in adds which attack rapidly with range for moderate damage, which you're meant to clear up by using the cannons, but assuming that nobody does the mechanics and just fully focuses the boss, Windwall Totem might just be BIS mitigation here. So I think that kind of explains why Windwall Totem deserves a spot on this list. Next up, we have the entry from the Priest, and Priest overall is a fantastic class in vanilla. They were difficult to find something for. They're a very strong and safe leveler for hardcore, they're a great healer at endgame, and they're amazing at PvP as Shadow. They have all the bases covered. So the class didn't have too many weird abilities which I could pick apart, other than one in particular, because for Priest the choice has to be the final talent in the Holy Tree, Lightwell. Now, I don't know what Blizzard had with Lightwell and making it just unreasonably bad, but even in TBC it was still super lackluster and found very few uses. However, in vanilla it's a whole other level of bad. So Lightwell is an ability that you place down on the ground and afterwards people can click on it to receive healing over 10 seconds. It has a short cast time and is also very cheap mana-wise for the amount of healing it provides, which doesn't sound too bad. But then we get to the downsides. First up is that this thing for some unknown reason has a 10-minute cooldown and only provides 5 charges of its healing effect, meaning barely anyone is ever going to get much use out of it. The second big issue is that if you take any damage whilst the Lightwell heal is active, it will be cancelled. So this makes this end of talent tree ability pretty much first aid with a 10-minute cooldown. And finally, any priest who has tried to use a Lightwell will know this, it's more or less impossible to actually get people to click on the Lightwell after they have A, just taken damage, B, will not be taking damage again for a while, and C, don't end up getting healed by another healer. They even kept the whole Lightwell heal gets cancelled when you take damage part in TBC, and it still had a 6-minute cooldown. For some reason, Blizzard just kept this talent really bad for a really long time, so all in all, Lightwell has to be the pick for Priest here. Next up, we have the Druid entry. You know, when I was going over what talents and abilities to include for the video, Druid could have had quite a few entries by itself. That was when I decided I should probably include some other classes so I'm not just picking on them. But Druid definitely has some questionable abilities and talents. But their first appearance on the list is a talent improved Moonfire, which increases the damage of this ability and crit chance of it by 10%. Moonfire is definitely one of the more iconic Druid abilities. I mean, who hasn't won a PvP fight with just Moonfire spam? That being said, it definitely has one or two problems. First is the high mana cost for what the spell does, partially because it's instant cast, partially because a good deal of the spell's power is in its damage over time effect, and if you're spamming it, obviously you don't benefit from the damage over time portion. Second is that, of course, damage over time effects don't crit in vanilla, and there's, well, kind of just more or less no haste effects for them to benefit from either. So if you deal damage in vanilla, you really don't want it to be damage over time, you want direct damage. And then we get to the improved Moonfire talent in the balance tree. Now, to be honest, the top half of the balance tree is just on the meh side, but but Improved Moonfire is essentially a mandatory 5-point talent sync so you can get access to Vengeance, which at max rank increases the damage bonus of your spell crits by 100%, which is good. I mean, as good as you can get when you're playing Boomkin, but it's still good. But you have to waste so many points to get to the good stuff in the balance tree that it really doesn't feel as satisfying to advance down as many other talent trees do. Overall though, Improved Moonfire is kind of just a symptom of a strange talent tree for balance druids. There are a lot of ideas going on here and most of them don't really pay off, and having to sink 5 points into a talent where only half of the spell can benefit from the crit modifier can only be described as a vanilla druid moment. Following druid at number 6 is the first pick from the hunter, because they are going to be making a repeat appearance as well. Hunter's in such a unique spot in vanilla with pets, training, ammo, the dead zone, and all the various mechanics they have to worry about, which no other class really has to. Anyways, my first pick for the hunter is going to be one of the AoE abilities in Volley. Now, to be fair, hunter has a whole side to it in vanilla, which is fine whilst leveling, but then you get to the endgame, your gear begins to scale, and you just don't use these abilities again. And what I'm talking about are your hunter abilities that do spell damage and scale with spell power, your fire-based traps in Immolation and Explosives, Serpent Sting, Arcane Shot, and of course, Volley. There is of course the spell power hunter thing that you may have heard of, where you stack spell power to increase the damage of these abilities along with survival talents, but it is really bad. I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually play it, ever. Hunters of course traditionally need agility and ranged attack power above anything else to deal damage, so all these spell power abilities just fall off incredibly hard. They were even still bad in the Burning Crusade as well. Blizzard only started to give attack power scaling to spells in Wrath, at which point things such as Explosive Trap became arguably super overpowered. But Volley is perhaps just the worst of Hunter's spell power abilities, which is why I'm picking it. Not only will it not be scaling with any stats you're building, it suffers from spell knockback, it has a high mana cost, its base damage is really bad, even its spell damage scaling is bad, and for some reason it has a 1-minute cooldown, and it's channeled as well. It's just overall a super subpar spell, and leaves Hunter's AoE capabilities as, well, you can just press multi-shot and yeah, that's about it I guess. A complete side note here, but I hope for Season of Discovery that Blizzard would have turned survival into the spell power hunter tree, where they actually care about stacking this stat to increase their damage over making them into a melee hunter. I think it would have been interesting to see how this unusual way of playing the class could work if it was really embraced, but this was probably out of the scope of what they had time to be doing in Season of Discovery. Either way, if survival changes in a significant way in the future, I still hope it goes down the spell power route rather than this whole melee thing. Also, it would be a reason to equip spell power mail on Alliance as a bonus. But overall for Hunter, I think that explains why I'm picking Volley. At number 5, we have the entry from the Rogue. The Rogue in vanilla is generally a very well-rounded class, performing well to above average in pretty much every area of the game. They even have so many niche bits of utility like detecting and disarming traps, or lockpicking doors or boxes. But it's something special to the Rogue which I want to pick on here, and that is their poisons. Or to be more specific, their damage dealing poisons. Their utility poisons, especially crippling and mind numbing, are amazing and can find so many uses in PvP and PvE. But then the poisons which are meant to do damage just kind of aren't very good, unfortunately. And it's a similar issue to what plagues Hunter with their spell power scaling abilities, and that is poisons don't scale. But for Rogue it's actually worse. So the whole spell power Rogue thing, which again you might have heard of where rogues scale with this stat, appears to be a bit of an alternative server happy accident. Maybe there was a patch or two where this worked on Blizzard servers, but on 1.12 it just doesn't work this way. So you know what Rogue poisons scale with? Nothing. Not spell power, not attack power, just straight up nothing. I mean, okay, we can say they scale with spell rank, you get a new rank, they do more damage, and you can put 5 points into the Vile Poison talent in the Assassination tree to make them do 20% more damage. But the highest rank of instant poison does about 130 damage on average. Do you want to spend 5 talent points so it maybe does about 150 damage each time it procs? Speaking of procs, poisons of course have charges in vanilla. The max rank of instant poison has 115 charges, so you're going to be reapplying these fairly often if you are regularly using them. And then of course there's deadly poison as well, which wouldn't have ever been functional during vanilla group content due to the debuff cap, and if you were solo by the time it was at 5 stacks, whatever you're fighting is going to be pretty much dead. But wait, there's more. Poisons are considered temporary weapon buffs, so they don't stack with things such as sharpening stones or even wind fury, and if you put poison on a weapon, there are only 2 ways to get rid of it. Wait 30 minutes hits or use up all the charges. I bet every Horde rogue player has accidentally used a poison on their main hand when grouped with a shaman, only to realise they just scammed themselves out of Wind Fury for a long time. I do really like the whole RPG side of creating your own poisons and it being a mini profession, and I was sad to see this go for rogues in Wrath of the Lich King. But for Blizzard to actually make poisons viable in Season of Discovery, for example, they had to create a room where poisons scaled with attack power and are just automatically applied on your weapon without you actually having to use them. At number 4 we have an ability from the Paladin, a class which nearly escaped being picked from this video at all, because although they have so many weird abilities, a lot of them do find uses within the game. But as somebody who's played a lot of Paladin throughout vanilla, there is one ability which I will happily call bad, despite it being one of the cooler ones, and that is Hammer of Wrath. This is one of your higher level abilities, with it not being available till level 44, so you kind of hope it will be good. Hammer of Wrath is Paladin's execute ability, with a 1-second cast time where it throws a hammer dealing moderate holy damage at an enemy at 20% health or less on a 6-second cooldown. So where do the problems start here? Probably on it having a cast time. Having a cast time as a melee is a bit of a disaster, as spells always reset your swing timer, meaning when you're toe-to-toe with an enemy, it is very rarely better to use Hammer of Wrath rather than just waiting for your weapon to swing again. In fact, I remember in TBC that tier 6 had a set bonus that increased the damage of Hammer of Wrath, and it was still completely unusable in PvE. Maybe you get one right at the end of the fight if nothing else could fit in the global. A 1-second cast is quite a commitment too. Not only is it interrupting your melee swing, but you're also subject to spell knockback during this time as well. Its mana cost is also just disproportionately high, being 425 at max rank. If you use a few of those, you're gonna be Of course, it's a spell, so it scales with spell power, which only protection is going to have in vanilla realistically. Remember, healing gear only gives plus healing in vanilla, and Ret is not really gonna have any spell power either. Apart from the fact that protection is probably going to be getting hit in the face, so they can never use Hammer of Wrath due to spell knockback. Blizzard did try to buff Hammer of Wrath in Season of Discovery, making it instant, and so it resets its cooldown when damaging a low health enemy, but it's still not used because it just costs too much mana. All in all though, you may snipe the odd mob running at low health, or get someone before they escape in PvP with Hammer of Wrath, but oftentimes it's just not worth the effort. Now we're heading into the top 3 territory for some truly bad abilities. At number 3 it's the second visit from the Hunter class, and this time around it's Mongoose Bite. So Mongoose Bite works in a similar way to Warrior's Overpower or Rogue's Riposte, where it needs to proc. The conditional here is that the Hunter must dodge an attack. However, unlike those two aforementioned abilities, both of which are very good, Mongoose Bite does not do weapon damage plus something extra. It just does the something extra part. Mongoose Bite rank 1 does 25 damage. Just 25, nothing else. At max rank it does 115, and that's the payoff for having dodged an attack, by the way. Fireball rank 4 that you get at level 18 does more damage than this. I mean, sure, you can macro Mongoose Bite into other stuff and not really think about it again, but it's always felt as though you're just losing out on mana whenever you press this ability to do a truly pitiful amount of damage. If it did weapon damage plus something extra, it would be very good, but as it is at the moment, I honestly don't even buy it. It just feels like a waste of gold until I'm at endgame, I have spare gold, and I think, oh, I didn't buy this yet. So overall, I think Mongoose Bite is worthy of the 3rd spot. At number 2, we're welcoming back the Druid for an ability which, when you read more about it, it just gets worse and worse. And this is one of their key tanking abilities too, which is Swipe. And we're talking about Bear Swipe here. Cat Swipe is either Season of Discovery or Wrath and Beyond. So let's talk about it. It's your key AoE threat generator that costs a pretty sizable 20 rage to use, and it will hit up to 3 nearby targets for about 80 damage at max rank, which sounds okay, until you realise for some absolutely insane reason that it doesn't scale with attack power, so the damage that it says it's going to do on the tooltip is what it does, and that will be the same when you first learn this, or you're in Bis Gear. With some of the other abilities it kind of makes sense why there's no scaling, but here there's just no logic that this one specific ability gains so few benefits from gearing up. I mean, Bear Druids do remain strong on single target, but with Swipe doing barely any damage and being capped at 3 targets as well, they can definitely struggle more on AoE, especially when any class with AoE decides to do more than just breathe on whatever you're fighting. All in all, Swipe is just in a strange place where I feel it's so much worse than it possibly could be, so that's why I'm picking it here, which means that the number 1 spot is going to be Warlock, for a talent which I can only describe by saying, why did you do this, Blizzard? So the entire of the demonology tree is a bit confusing confusing. It has you spend 20 points on making your demon stronger, and then it says, okay, now sacrifice your demon to gain various buffs. It worked this way in TBC as well, by the way. The demonology tree also features plenty of 5-point talents which do practically nothing. 5 points for 15% mana on your demon, another 5 for 15% health, and another 5 for 20% auto attack damage. That's 15 points which go practically in the bin. I think only Balanced Druid could compete with this number of dead talents, and that's without you potentially spending another 5 points on improved Subjugate Demon to buff this spell, which is very occasionally useful, apart from the fact that it still breaks all the time. But all the talents in this tree and other abilities in this video pale before what is the worst of the worst in vanilla, and that is the talent Improved Spellstone. Have you ever actually used Spellstone in vanilla? I'm not entirely sure that I have. There are scenarios where I've considered it, but it just wasn't worth using. With the talent though, it would absorb 1200 spell damage when you use it, which is honestly great, but then here come the downsides. First of all, Spellstone and Firestone for that matter are offhands in vanilla, so after you conjure them you have to wait the equip cooldown before you can use them, and they'll disappear if you log out for too long. When you use Spellstone, it removes all magical effects on you. A bunch of world buffs, consumes, and other class buffs are magical effects, which makes this a big no-no. And probably the single biggest issue with this talent is that it is the only talent in the game which for some inexplicable reason shares a row with a capstone talent, meaning even if you did want to take it, you have to way overinvest talent points in this tree to be able to do so. Overall, the downsides of Spellstone are just way too great to use it all that often. It takes up an item slot, and to get the talent you're going to be going at least 32 points into Demonology, which can stop you from picking as many good talents in the other trees. The Demonology tree as a whole is a bit of a mess, to be honest, and Improved Spellstone is just the cherry on top of this entire spec.
Raiding in classic World of Warcraft so far has been, for the most part, fairly straightforward. Especially among top players, it's a totally different game from retail WoW. The Race to World First is a huge event for dozens of players, putting in hundreds of pulls on some of the most tightly tuned bosses Blizzard has recently cooked up. For us over in Classic, it's more of a surprise if the bosses make it past the first hour, never mind the first reset. And despite the chasm between the two, there will always be the player who wants to go the extra mile, get every ounce of performance possible out of their class, and be, as they would say, a Giga Chad pumper. Today I want to cover the most interesting ways players have taken advantage of in-game mechanics, stacked buffs, and found new ways to interact with items and so on in order to get that extra bit of performance out of their character. There is a lot of variation from different methods in terms of putting a number on what the actual DPS benefit would be. For some it's a tiny difference, for others it's upwards of 30%. Easily. Right then, we have to start somewhere, and it's gonna be Feral Druids. There's something about this spec which attracts people who are just built different. From day one of Classic, there's always been some weird way to optimize performance of this particular class and spec. In fact, this is more or less the Feral Druid part of the video. They have the most class-specific optimizations that I can think of. Now, Feral Druids, despite equipping weapons, don't actually attack with those weapons. They're clawing away as a cat or mauling as a bear, and that meant in Classic and TBC your weapon was more or less a stat stick, as melee weapons are to hunters. Also, you couldn't proc some of the BIS enchants like Crusader or Mongoose and had to use agility instead. These all seem like very negative things, but it gave rise to a level 29 weapon from Gnomeregan becoming the best item you could equip for the entire expansion. Yes, throughout all of Classic there was nothing better. It was replaced in TBC eventually due to raw stats outpacing it, but in Classic as a Feral, if you really wanted to perform, you had to go and farm manual crowd pummelers. This was about a 1 in 3 drop from an optional boss in Noma called Crowd Pummeler 960, who you can get to in a few minutes from the back door of the instance. What makes it so good is the on-use effect. Since your weapon is just raw stats, the fact you could add 50% attack speed for 30 seconds was a buff that nothing else in the game could match, meaning to really push performance, you kinda had to go and farm these. And oh boy, did you have to farm a lot of them. You see the tooltip where it says 3 charges? Each 1 in 3 drop from a level 29 boss gave you 90 seconds of God mode, and then you needed to go farm another and another and another. Oh, and dungeons would lock you out after 5 resets within 1 hour. Goes without saying, but a reset took less than 12 minutes. This was best in slot for bear and cat, by the way, both benefited hugely from the increased attack speed. Out of everything we go over today, this would have probably been the most time consuming to do, and it didn't make you top DPS either, like not even remotely close to what warriors were capable of doing. But that is not all cats had to do. In addition to your level 29 weapon, you also had a level 40 helm that was BIS forever, the Wolf Head's Helm. This was used for the majority of TBC as well, though I believe at some point raw stats on items did overtake it. Wolf's Head Helm was used to perform something called power shifting. Now, back in Classic and TBC, energy regenerated at a rate of 20 per 2 seconds, not as a constant bar filling up like it's in Wrath and, well, every single expansion beyond that. And as you can see on this helm, it grants 20 energy when shifting into cat. Over in the talent tree, what if we combine this with the Fura talent, which gave a further 40 energy when entering cat form? Well, that's 60 energy for leaving and re-entering cat. If you time this correctly with the energy tick, that would give you a further 20, and you went from near an empty energy bar to a nearly full one in the matter of about 1 second. This technique simply gave you more energy to use on shred than you could possibly achieve just waiting for your bar to fill up normally. It was, however, very mana intensive to maintain, meaning druids went through many more mana potions and dark rune than your average DPS would. And no, it still didn't make you top DPS either. But wait, there's more on feral druids. After having spent many nights in Gnomeregan farming weapons and wearing a level 40 helm in TBC, Blizzard had one more curveball for you. In patch 2.2, changes were made to regeneration effects in World of Warcraft to try and make them more consistent across the board. Under the old tick-based system, sometimes using a spell on the moment when the tick occurred would cause you to partially use the benefit of some of that spell, such as Innovate or Evocation not actually giving their full duration. A change was made so instead of the tick happening globally, it now happened on a player-by-player basis, and also very importantly, any change a player made to their personal tick timer would reset it, as well as then refunding any resources that would have been lost due to the change in the timer. Okay, you still with me here? So essentially, instead of you being able to power shift, gaining 20 energy from your Wolf's Head Helm, 40 from Fura, and then another 20 a moment later from the global tick, it was now the case where you were shifting into cat. That was a change in your energy regeneration and the timer reset, meaning you were sitting there for about a full 2 seconds waiting for your energy tick. This made your rotation much slower than it used to be. Enter Weak Troll's Blood Potion. This level 8 consumable gave you a minor amount of health regen. Using and cancelling this effect at the start of a power shift would make the game consider a change in your regeneration rate, and would therefore restore some resources which have been lost in the change, such as energy. So druids would have to shift into cat form, drink a Weak Troll's Blood Potion, cancel the buff within about a 0.5 second window by the way, cast shred, the energy tick happens, cast second shred, and then power shift again and chug another potion. This means that druids were going through 1 potion every 4 seconds in order to match what power shifting was able to do previously. Or if we take a 3-minute fight as an example, a feral druid would go through 45 potions. And this was just to be back in middle of the pack DPS, by the way. It's been a roller coaster for feral mains, I'll say that much. Enough about druids though, because I have loads of other things I want to cover. Because you can't talk about min-maxing buffs without at least giving a throwback to world buffs in Classic. We're going to go all the way from the fairly easy ones to the I don't know how people put up with these ones. Spirit of Zandalar I would say was the easiest to get by far. You go and hand in the Heart of Hakara at Yojamba Isle, and about 30 seconds later the Spirit of Zandalar buff goes out for every player on the isle as well as in Booty Bay, and you can see it gives a pretty huge chunk of stats, though definitely much better for physical classes. Best of all, there was no cooldown on handing this in bar a short bit of roleplay, and it was undispellable, nice and easy. And at one point, somehow, someway, the Spirit of Zandalar buff was added to the player's spellbook with no global cooldown. You could literally run around spamming the buff for others and it would grant it to everyone in your zone. It was pretty hilarious, unintended, and of course it got fixed. Next, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. It was layer specific. This got changed to across all layers later on in Classic. But for a lot of Classic, you had to be on the correct layer for the buff. This buff was given out after handing in the Head of Nefarian or Onyxia in Stormwind or Orgrimmar. This conferred a huge buff to all players in the affected area, whatever level they were. Yes, you could get this on a level 1. Yes, it made leveling insane. Now, the problem was, apart from having to be on the correct layer, was that the quest hand-in had a 6-hour cooldown independent of each hand-in. And sometimes as a guild you want to buff, but hey, it's still on a 4-hour cooldown. That's a problem. What do we do about that? Well, you had to reset the quest NPC. This meant getting a member, usually a priest of the opposing faction, to come and mind control the quest NPC so you can then take them out, because when they respawn in a few minutes you could do another hand-in. Unless you had that one guy that kept killing the mind controller and stopping literally hundreds of people from getting the buff, which definitely happened, by the way. Now we have the Diamor North buffs, or more commonly known as the tribute buffs. So this was a little more complicated to get. A tribute run is completing Diamor North whilst keeping many of the bosses alive. At the end of the run, when you defeat King Gordok, you're declared the new King of Diamor, and you can run back through the instance and talk to the bosses which you left alive for their tribute. And for most of the bosses, this tribute was a buff that you can see on the screen here. Yes, all of these stack too, by the way. Now, this is where the problems begin. See, clearing Diamor North takes time, and if you have your other world buffs running already, you just, well, don't have time to do that. Fortunately, however, hunters would commonly clear Diamor North solo as a gold farm, and then they could sell the cleared ID to somebody else. But you still had to get to Diamor, which is in the absolute middle of nowhere. So people would buy summons to get to the instance. Players would have several accounts with summoning networks set up to get people inside the instance, sometimes inside the actual instance portal, to mitigate the risk of getting ganked. Oh, and just to mention it as well, Diamor North buffs are magical, so they can be dispelled, meaning now you don't have to worry about dying and losing buffs. Now it's any priest, shaman, or any other magical dispel can remove your efforts. And we aren't done yet. In fact, we're very far from done. Next, you need another summon to get to Felwood for your Songflower buff. So this buff comes as part of a quest chain in Felwood, where eventually you can cleanse several of the plants around the zones for buffs such as food, or in this case a whole bunch of crit and stats. Now, each plant had an individual 25-minute cooldown, depending on layer of course, and any person who used it would start that cooldown. However, I'm not sure whether it was thanks to our good friend spell batching or if everybody just spammed it at the same time, but if everyone clicked it the moment it came up, everybody would be able to pick up the buff around it. Oh, but in case you thought this was getting too easy, this buff only lasts 1 hour and it's magic dispellable. Gotta be careful. Our next step can be the easiest or by far the most difficult. We need to go to the Darkmoon Fair. This event is only available once per month for 1 week, rotating between Elwyn Forest outside Stormwind or Morgor outside of Thunder Bluff. Of course, even on PvP servers, both of these zones are not contested, meaning as an Alliance player in Elwyn, I can very safely stroll out of Stormwind and pick up my buff, no problem. Oh, and by the way, the buff is just 10% more flat damage after you pick some certain options from Soothsayer Sage, so it's pretty massive. The hard part comes in when you have to go to the other factions fair, because they know people will be coming to the zone and they are going to be force flagged on PvP servers, whilst they will not be, meaning people would actively defend the buff from the opposing faction. Creative workarounds such as invisibility potions and having someone in your group join a battleground were used to make picking up this buff consistent, as when your battleground queue pops, you can use a weak aura to instantly accept the correct options from Sage, then join the battleground and leave, and you'll be ported to wherever that person joined the battleground from. So all in all, it was very much doable. And we aren't done yet either. The final buff we need to pick up was relatively easy for the Horde and nightmare fuel for the Alliance. However, I will say it's essentially a melee only buff, which made me happy that I chose Warlock because I did not have to deal with picking this up personally. I'm of course talking about Warchief's Blessing. The bit you care about on this buff is the 15% melee haste for 1 hour, which is an absolute enormous amount. Okay, so prepare yourself for what we need to do to pick this one up. On Horde, there is a quest to kill Rend Blackhand in Upper Black Rock Spire as part of their Onyxia attunement called For the Horde, i.e. you can only do this once per character, meaning you have to try and actively monitor players around the appropriate level and whisper them asking if they're going to be handing in. in. I remember getting whispers on my shaman anytime I went near Thrall. After you hand in, a mere 8 seconds later, the buff will drop in Orgrimmar, and about 17 seconds later will also drop in the Crossroads. The roleplay on many of the other hand-ins gave you plenty of time, a good 30 seconds or so to get logged in whenever the buff was called, but with Warchief's Blessing, you kinda already had to be logged in and waiting. And at this point in time, since it's a 1 hour buff, you're gonna have other buffs running too, so you don't want to be logged in for too long either. Also, the buff going out has a 3-hour cooldown, and you can't reset it because, well, it's Thrall himself who gives out the buff. You can't exactly walk into Orgrimmar and mind control a Warchief. Now, the thing about this buff is it was faction specific. Only Horde players can get it. Or can they? What if Alliance players did a little bit of changing of factions at the moment when the buff was granted? Well, in fact, they could. Back in Classic, when you got mind controlled by a member of the opposing faction, you would change to their faction for its duration. This was changed in TBC at some point. Now, if you've been following what I've been going on about, you'll notice that Warchief's Blessing only drops in Orgrimmar or the Crossroads, which as an Alliance player aren't exactly places which you want to be, meaning you would have to get summoned somewhere that often used creative game mechanics to get to. After getting summoned, you find out in Discord when the buff drops. You don't want to be logged in too early, but after you log in, you need to then get mind controlled, get the buff, drop the mind control, and then port out to Stormwind and hide somewhere because you'll be flagged for PvP and you still could get dispelled. And now you're ready to raid. It's just that easy. Oh, and keep in mind with all these buffs, you can easily hit the buff cap. Yes, there is a buff cap, by the way, which is 32. This meant, for example, using heals over time on a druid was quite literally griefing your raid because a rejuvenation could knock off Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, leading to a very angry DPS player. But I think you get the idea with world buffs. They were certainly something. Actually, there were a couple more buffs you could get if you really wanted to go all out. In fact, there were a lot more than this. I'll cover a couple of the more interesting ones though. You'll probably remember Diamond Flask. This was a really unique trinket that only warriors could get as part of their class questline. It gave a bunch of strength as well as a small amount of healing over its duration. Now, there were two things on this quest which may not be immediately obvious. First of all, if you didn't pick this item as a quest reward, ouch, that is all I can say, because for some unknown reason the healing it granted scaled with the amount of bonus healing power that the warrior had equipped at the time on a 1-to-1 ratio, and it snapshotted that value. This means warriors would actually have a full-on bonus healing set with enchanted weapons, trinkets and everything else. I've heard of warriors outbidding healers for rejuvenating gem in GDKPs before for their healing set. They put on their healing set, use their diamond flask, then swap to their real gear and are healing a ton throughout the fight passively. This was genuinely a very good thing to do for very obvious reasons in PvP and certain fights where you took regular damage, such as Sapphiron, Veilstraz, Viscidus, or even Lotheb, where the heal kept you topped off, made this an incredibly powerful trinket. And the fact that it snapshotted healing whatsoever was just frankly bizarre. In patch notes from vanilla in 1.7, that's the ZG patch, it says all item-based self-heals will no longer be affected by equipment that provides bonuses to healing, and they give examples of Arcanite Champion and Crusader enchants. So fun detected, fun left alone, I suppose. But that's not all you got from this quest, because upon actually handing in at the NPC, he would cast an AoE mega battle shout which affected all nearby units. This lasted a short 15 minutes and was a bonus 400 attack power, which didn't stack with regular battle shout, but it was worth getting if you were going all out. Next one is definitely one of the more obscure ones, and I wonder how many of you guys will remember this. This was an alliance only buff, which of course meant it got nerfed very quickly. Okay, for real though, this would have been the most powerful world buff to ever exist and would have led to some truly insane boss clear times. It was part of the Alliance Onyxia attunement during the jailbreak part of the quest. NPC Marshal Windsor would have a buff called Windsor's Frenzy, which gave 65% attack speed to all nearby friendly units. That is more than double heroism. However, it was supposed to be just an aura for Windsor himself and nearby allies, but for a time it was actually buffing nearby allies instead, so Alliance players had access to a 65% attack speed buff, though it only did last for 10 minutes. It would have allowed for passes was like nothing else we've ever seen before, but hey, it didn't last. Soon after, it was patched to work correctly and just buff units near Windsor instead of buffing players, so not too much was ever done with it. One final buff from Classic that was available as part of the Scourge invasion, again stacked with every other buff in the game because why not? Actually, this buff was used for many of the fastest clears of Nax 25 in Wrath of the Lich King Classic because, yeah, everyone kind of forgot about it existing and it still worked in raids. Whoops. It's been nerfed now, by the way. Anyways, Soul Revival is given out in the area nearby after a damaged necrotic shard is destroyed by defeating the nearby Scourge. It takes a while to deplete all of its health, but when it does, it's a huge 10% further boost to your damage, but it only lasts for 30 minutes, so you do have to make the most of it as soon as possible. Now, you'll probably notice that, well, everything so far has been from Classic, as in Vanilla Classic, because it was completely degenerate when it came to doing this kind of min-maxing, but there was one discovery made during the Burning Crusade which I distinctly remember because I used it in raids on my Paladin, and that was Battle Chicken stacking. Okay, so Gnomish Battle Chicken needs 230 engineering to make. It's a 20-minute cooldown trinket that summons a chicken to assist you in combat. Doesn't really do all that much damage or anything, but when it's in combat it has a chance to proc Battle Squawk, giving 5% melee haste for 4 minutes. Now this trinket had been around since Classic, but it was too high RNG on getting the proc to happen, and it was too short duration to make the most out of it. Or was it? Midway through the Burning Crusade, a way to force proc Battle Squawk was discovered. It turns out if your character receives any hostile action and then you pop the trinket, it would consistently send out the buff a few seconds later. Hostile action meaning anything from an enemy, it doesn't matter if you dodge or resist. As long as something happens to your character, the buff should then go out. Best of all, this buff stacked with your group. You could have 4 minutes of 25% extra melee haste. That's only 5% less than Heroism for an entire 4 minutes, which was more than the duration of many boss fights in TBC. And you could swap out the trinket after the buff went out. It didn't even disappear, making this a huge DPS gain. Players would begin to figure out safe ways to proc chickens before fights started, such as keeping one NPC alive which AoEs, or taunting the water elementals in front of Hydros, to name 2. Either way, in a later patch, Blizzard accidentally fixed this interaction. Here's what they had to say about it. With restarts this week, we deployed a hotfix for a bug where Illidan was not respecting the initial cooldown on some of his abilities, such as his phase 5 Enrage. A knock-on effect from this fix is that Battle Squawk from the Gnomish Battle Chicken can no longer bypass its initial cooldown period as it could pre 2.1 WoW. Battle Squawk now observes its correct initial cooldown rules as it did starting in patch 2.1. It was probably for the best that it happened, though it would have made for some new and interesting tactics in the Sunwell on how to best proc your chicken. During Vanilla Classic, players would often go the extra mile to get that extra little bit of DPS, whether it was stacking all the available consumables, collecting all the open world buffs from around Azeroth, or paying your Disc Priest 5 gold per power infusion. The content might have been easy, but that did not stop players from wanting to compete with one another on the DPS meters. And vanilla class design and boss stacking could get really out of control sometimes. Small trinkets from quests, consumables and items that were added into the game because they sounded like a cool idea have come to be relied upon as key pieces to solving puzzles as to how to get the best performance out of your class and specialization that you possibly can. For some classes though, they had to think quite far outside the box or explore ways to play which, well, weren't exactly all that intuitive. In fact, some of the techniques people used are more or less meme-worthy, but still fun to remember. Today I'm going to go over a few more ways that players min-max their characters in Vanilla Classic. Of course, we're starting with Feral Druids. Again, I swear every time I do one of these videos, some kind of weird new tech appears for Feral Druids. I think they're just trying not to play the game normally on purpose at this point. Anyways, back in Classic, Ferals worked a little differently from every other melee class. One of the biggest reasons why is because they didn't attack directly with their weapons, instead their auto attacks were shredding away in cat form or mauling in bear.
This meant they couldn't benefit from some of the most powerful buffs or enchants in the game, such as Wind Fury weapon or Crusader. Each of these needed your melee weapon to be hitting directly in order to proc, and you couldn't exactly just drop form and start meleeing in order to proc them. That would just be too much of a DPS loss. But what if there was a way to bypass this requirement, a buff that didn't need you to hit directly with your melee weapon and instead would just proc off any physical damage dealt? Well, fortunately for ferals, such an item existed. Dragon's Breath Chili. Craftable at 200 cooking, this recipe was sold by vendors across Dustswallow Marsh and Desolace. Eating it will place a 10-minute poison effect on the player, which would give attacks a chance to proc a fire breath type effect in a wide cone in front of you. The proc chance for this is a little bit unclear, but it wouldn't be classic if they just told you how something works now, would it? Wowhead reckons a 5% proc chance with a 10-second internal cooldown, but other comments suggested a lower proc chance and no internal cooldown. Whilst how often this thing procs might be a little bit uncertain, what isn't is the fact that this proc effect used to scale 1-to-1 with the caster's spell power, meaning the more spell power that you have, the bigger effect this proc will be. This, of course, meant that, in theory, you could min-max a fire-breathing feral druid DPS specialization, which would actually have access to cleave damage, or alternatively pop the consume on a feral tank for better access to burst threat. In Classic, there were a ton more consumables too, including consumables specifically designed for certain spell schools. If you were going all out, you would be able to pop a flask of supreme power, a greater arcane elixir, and an elixir of greater firepower to buff up your fire feral spec. Now, doing this practically presented several problems, such as the fact that Molten Core and Blackwing Lure are full of mobs which are completely immune to fire damage. Mages were even playing Frost during these tiers. Also, I really hope you like farming gold if you wanted to do this, because wow, these consumables will get expensive. On the positive side, having cleave, especially in dungeons, is very useful. You would 100% pull threat if chili procced on a pull, or maybe it would break a polymorph, or pull mobs that are way in the back because the proc radius is so large. Maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. You also may remember Druid tier gear in Classic just has pretty much every single stat in the game because, I don't know, Druids, they do a bit of everything, right? Just give them a bit of every stat. Playing Fire Feral, you're taking much better advantage of this questionable itemization. Silver linings, right? Other melee classes could do this too, but I just wanted to highlight the ferals here. Speaking of fire, fire mages had an interesting tech back in Classic to min-max their DPS. It was actually an effort that all the fire mages in the raid had to organize among themselves to get the most out of the talent Ignite. Now, in Classic, there was a finite number of debuffs allowed on an enemy mob. This was set to 16. Any debuff that went over that limit would cancel out something else which had already been applied to the mob, and you really didn't want to cancel out your Sunder Armor or your Curse of Recklessness, for example. So if you had two mages spamming Fireball, there would be the small damage over time effect of the Fireball spell itself, and the Ignite damage over time from any crits that they dealt. You can see how this is going to cause problems, as that's a lot of debuff slots for two players. The Fireball dot itself was treated as a minor debuff, however, and it did next to no damage either, so it would be pushed off the debuff table by itself. Ignite, however, was treated as a major debuff, unlike any other passively applied damage over time effect in the game, that is, which more or less meant it's not going to get pushed off the debuff table. However, if each mage was taking up a major debuff slot by playing fire, the spec would kind of just not have been viable. Debuffs are valuable things that help the whole raid after all, not just personal DPS gains. Fortunately, somebody at Blizzard realized this and made an adjustment to Ignite, where all mages share the same Ignite debuff. However, only the first 5 critical strikes applied will determine how much damage this damage over time effect will do. Any of the fire crits after that will only refresh the damage over time instead of modifying it any further. This was called a rolling Ignite. So to start off the fight, you would Scorch to get the fire vulnerability debuff up as soon as possible, cast a few frost bolts so the weak Ignite effect had time to drop off, and then pop all your trinkets, your cooldowns and so on, and hope to get the
the biggest fireballs possible. Whichever mage dealt the first crit would also claim the ignite for the purposes of the DPS meters, meaning on some fights, such as Chromagus with good RNG, mages could do more than TBC levels of DPS. I always like to think of rolling ignite as all the mages are building a big bonfire together and then maintaining it with crits. A quick one that I remember people also doing in Blackwing Lure was a tactic that anybody could use on Veilstraz. One of the mechanics in the encounter was burning adrenaline. This will place a debuff on a target, increasing damage done and reducing cast time by 100%. However, after a short duration, you would explode, instantly dying and taking anybody nearby with you. And in Classic, there were also world buffs in the raid, so going to all that preparation to get them and then getting the bomb on Veil was pretty annoying. It is an unavoidable death mechanic after all, or is it? Well, it turns out that 100% cast time reduction worked on any cast, including Hearthstone. You hearthed out before the debuff timer hit 0 and it would remove that debuff from you instantly, keeping you alive and keeping your world buffs active. After a certain incident involving Zul'Gurub and a blood plague, Blizzard became a little more wary of allowing debuffs to be taken outside of raid, so let's just say that. After that, you'd have to be summoned back outside the entrance portal of Blackwing Lure and then rejoin your raid, but at least you'd still have all your world buffs running. Next, we have a hunter trick to optimize DPS. This started off in Classic, but it didn't become super popular until late the Burning Crusade. It's called melee weaving. So to this day in Wrath of the Lich King, there's a minimum range the hunter must stand from the target in order to be able to attack them with ranged attacks. In Wrath, it's 5 yards, even though when you're fighting any dragon boss, it feels more like 25. But back in vanilla, it was 8 yards. However, one big difference is that the swing timers for melee and ranged attacks were tracked separately. This means you could fire off a shot from your bow at 8 yards, run inside the 5-yard range, land a melee attack with your weapon, run back out to 8 yards, and your swing timer would be coming up again on your bow. Rinse and repeat, and that is a melee weave. This was done to min-max the 2 different swing timers and would lead to higher DPS than regular play, at much greater effort and much greater margin for error. In TBC, the minimum distance for ranged attacks was moved down from 8 yards to 5. Yes, melee is also 5 yards too. Technically, there's a very small difference between the two. This meant the process of a successful melee weave could be achieved with a lot less movement. On top of that, both factions now had access to Wind Fury on a big two-handed weapon, which also added a nice extra bit of DPS. Looking at all the top logs for Brutalis, the big patchwork fight to the Sunwell, it's all BM hunters melee weaving. Moving into Wrath, Blizzard made a change where melee and ranged weapons swing timers now share the same cooldown, effectively stopping this from being a viable way to gain DPS overnight. Finally, I'm going to try and explain something which I'm pretty sure I still don't even understand. Weapon skill scaling in Classic WoW. So weapon skill, you all know what it is. You get a nice big upgrade, you go enchant it, gem it, put it on, hit something, and then get a message in your chat saying your skill in maces is now 14 and feel very bad. It's still a thing in Wrath and was in TBC, and in these expansions it's kind of just a number you need to get maxed out to be dealing the most effective damage with whatever type of weapon it is you're using. There used to be a ton more importance tied to your weapon skill, and it wasn't until a later patch in TBC when expertise was introduced as a stat that weapon skill got relegated to a semi-forgettable thing you just need to max out. Expertise, of course, affecting the chance for your attacks to be dodged or parried, making it an important stat alongside hit. Back in Classic, it was a whole other ball game. Weapon skill was so important and so rarely available on items that it made a level 44 pair of male bind on equipped gloves best in slot for warriors for near the entire game. Why though? Well, in very simple term, weapon skill on items could take you beyond the weapon skill cap, and the benefit from weapon skill continued to scale beyond the cap too. It was like the difference between attacking a mob that's 3 or more levels above you, where their level shows as orange, and a mob that's within 2 levels of you, where their level shows as yellow. To go in depth a little bit more, weapon skill is normally capped out at 300, and in vanilla it affected the chance for your attacks to be dodged, parried, blocked, but also importantly impacted your hit chance as well as glancing blows. What's a glancing blow though? Well, against an enemy that's a higher level than you, you'll have a chance to land a glancing blow. Against a level 63 for example, which is the level that all raid bosses would have been with 300 weapon skill, your attacks would have a 40% chance to be a glancing blow. When that happens, they deal 65% of their regular damage, which is a pretty big hit to your DPS. But what if we got our weapon skill above what is the normal cap? Well, with the likes of Edge Masters, the human racial for swords, or axes for orcs, you could do exactly that. Going up to 305 weapon skill causes you to be able to overcome the built-in 1% miss chance on all attacks in the game too. Here's a short little message from a blue post on this. They say there is some code in 1.12 that explicitly adds a modifier that causes the first 1% of hit gained from talents or gear to be ignored against monsters with more than 10 defense skill above the attacking player's weapon skill. This means the so-called hit cap is in effect 9% rather than 8% for a player with 300 weapon skill fighting a level 63 monster with a defense skill of 315. With a weapon skill of 305 from sword spec from humans or axe spec from orcs, this hit modifier is no longer in place against monsters 3 or more levels above you, provided you're using the correct weapon type, that is. This makes weapon skill very good against raid level monsters. As for glancing blows, when at 300 weapon skill they were a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 65% of normal damage. At 305 weapon skill, this was changed to a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 85% of normal damage. So all in all, these gloves, or getting to 305 weapon skill, allowed you to overcome the base 1% miss chance and reduce the effect of glancing blows by 20%. You can see why items such as Edge Masters fetch such a high price, or alternatively you could just roll human and orc and save yourself a few thousand gold and get this racial bonus for free. All in all, there were so many ways to min-max your character in Classic. The gameplay might have been simple, the bosses might have been easy, but to actually understand how and why everything worked the way it did does get very complicated when you start to look into it. I mean, even during Classic, a near 20-year-old game at this point, players were still trying to fully uncover exactly how everything works. And on TBC servers that are now in Wrath, we're still discovering new min-maxes, new techniques, new talent builds, and so on. It's definitely one of the more interesting areas to cover in videos, and proves that even a game this old, that many think is super solved, can still throw out the odd surprise now and again.
Dungeons, that 5-player content that gets you into the world of PvE in World of Warcraft. From humble beginnings in the Deadmines or Ragefire Chasm, all the way to today in modern WoW, with whole tournaments based around who can complete the highest level Mythic Plus keys. Whether it was for a quest, the loot, or just to see what was behind that blue swirly entrance. Dungeons have always been a core part of World of Warcraft, and many of them are amazing. However, some of them are not so good. But which are the best and which are the worst? Well, today I'm going to be covering what for me was the worst dungeon of each expansion in World of Warcraft so far. I'll be doing this in order, and we're going to be going by order of dungeons from least bad to I hope I never see this one again, not by order of expansions. So dungeons at the start of the video aren't so bad for their expansion, but I do have to pick one, and the ones at the end will be the dungeons that I hope I never see when I hit the LFD button. So that's it, one dungeon per expansion has to be picked. Let's make a start. And the first expansion up is actually going to be Battle for Azeroth. BFA really didn't have a bad dungeon overall in my opinion. And yes, before you think this is me secretly preparing you for BFA Classic wouldn't be so bad. For real though, it had a lot of very solid entries. I didn't even mind Tol Dagor, and I think that's the dungeon people have a problem with in BFA. The real annoying part of it was Sanguine Week during Mythic Plus, but there was a small trick you could do called not doing the dungeon that week, and you never had to do that. But the worst dungeon of BFA for me had to be part of Operation Mechagon, specifically the outside part. The inside bit was fine, to be honest, and remember, it was a 2-part dungeon, kind of like how Return to Karazhan was in Legion. It just felt like there was a lot of roaming trash, and it was annoying to have to dodge stuff and you were rushing in between each bosses rather than progressing through a dungeon in kind of a normal sense. And just full on using an open zone for a dungeon doesn't quite work in my opinion. We're going to see this be a recurring theme throughout the video, by the way, and I'd rather see some kind of different environment or things things change in a way that we haven't seen before, or at least a new part of the zone in a cave or over a hill or just a new island, something that's a bit fresh basically. Still, it's not a terrible dungeon by any stretch of the imagination, and BFA was a strong expansion when it came to 5-man content for me, but that's my pick here. Next up is Vanilla, and sure, it's not an expansion, but it is a version of World of Warcraft, and it had a whole lot of 5-man content. And for Vanilla specifically, I didn't want to pick a dungeon which realistically is off limits to Horde and Alliance. In other words, I'm not going to pick either Stockades or Ragefire Chasm, but all in all for Vanilla, after quite a bit of thought, what I'm going to pick are in fact the Razorfen dungeons, and this just goes for both of them. Now, I will admit I didn't want to pick something that was off limits to either faction, but me picking these dungeons is definitely the result of me playing Alliance more often than not. Both of these dungeons are pretty annoying to get to, they don't have many quests, the Quillbore just feel like a kind of average enemy. Still, these dungeons aren't too bad, and there's definitely some very good loot in them, so that's a reason to go there. Then again, I do have to pick one dungeon per expansion, so that is going to be the choice for Vanilla. Next up, I have Shadowlands, and there's going to be a lot of the more recent expansions near the top of the list, and I think that goes to show that dungeon design has improved over time in general. Well, at least for me it has. And Shadowlands might be a bit more of a look down upon expansion, but the dungeons as a whole weren't too bad in there, I don't think. But for Shadowlands, I picked Mists of Turner Scythe, and the reason is basically the maze. I don't understand the maze, and I have no idea what's going on in that dungeon, and I found some of the boss fights kind of annoying in there as well. Really, there isn't too much to comment on it other than that, but if ever I had a choice for which dungeon I'd be loading in for the Shadowlands, this will be the one that I'd want to see the least. Following that is Warlords of Draenor, another harshly criticised expansion, but again another one with pretty good dungeons as a whole. The big divide in opinions for Warlords of Draenor is absolutely going to be Grim Rail Depot, which was Blizzard attempting to have a dungeon on a moving train. It was a pretty tight space, there wasn't a lot of room to maneuver, but I thought as a whole it was okay and it fit the theme that they were going for in the first place. I suppose we should be kind of glad there wasn't Mythic Plus back then. If Tol Dagor was a nightmare on Sanguine, just imagine this place, it would have been impossible. But if I have to pick a worse one, I'm going to pick Iron Docks, and I think it's just because of the kind of minor annoyances that you have in the dungeon, such as when you're running through that gauntlet type part of it and you're being fired at and then you have to hide and then one person gets left behind. The fact that the last boss in the dungeon has to constantly talk as you're progressing through it, and I don't know about you, but I pretty much always have game sounds on, so I remember that very vividly. And when you get to the last boss, they knock you back 2 or 3 times during the fight and you have to run back up to them again, dodging stuff. Overall, it's really not that bad of a dungeon though, but if I have to pick, it is this one. Next is the War Within, and for me, the worst dungeon of this expansion so far is the Dawnbreaker, and it's similar reasoning to the pick for the outside of Operation Mechagon in BFA. It's another open world zone with bad guys, but this time you have to fly in between stuff. Personally, I'd rather be on the ground for dungeons rather than flying. At least you can follow along a bit easier with where you're supposed to be going, and I find flying can be a bit confusing in terms of route, which trash packs to clear and so on. And as already talked about, it's just using an open zone for a dungeon, which I'd rather not see. I'd rather have something a little bit different. I suppose the whole zone is used in this case because you are flying and we have dragon riding, which is super fast, so if this were a regular sized dungeon, you'd be in the air for a couple of seconds before you land again, at which point why even have flying? So with that in mind for the War Within, you're never going to guess what I'm going to pick for Dragonflight. Yep, it's the Knockhood Offensive. In fact, Dawnbreaker and Knockhood are kind of interchangeable for me. They both work in a very similar way to one another, where there's a lot of flying in between stuff. Except in Knockhood, you had that one mob who would yell "let fly" at you every 3 nanoseconds, and that is the big differentiator between the two for me. Again, not exactly a bad dungeon, but one that I'd have to pick for reasons I've really already gone over. Which brings us to what is kind of the halfway point of the video, at least expansions wise. All of the dungeons so far were the least good of their respective expansions, but there was nothing overall too bad, nothing that I'd mind doing too much. The expansions and dungeons that remain, however, are where things start to get really bad. And we're going to start off with Wrath of the Lich King and the dungeon that everyone loves to hate, the Oculus. Oh man, back in Wrath originally, when you saw this bad boy on your loading screen in the LFG, there was a pretty good chance somebody would just instantly leave rather than sit through this nightmare. The funny thing is, Oculus is actually one of the fastest dungeons to complete in Wrath, and Blizzard even added extra rewards to it in Wrath Classic to make people want to sit it out. You see, and I'm sure we can all agree with this, the problem with the Oculus wasn't me, it was everyone else, and it only took one person to really not want to learn what to do for this dungeon to be way more difficult than it needed to be. People just don't want to learn new abilities on a mount. Some people weren't used to having a vertical hitbox when flying to different platforms. You all know how it goes, you get to one of the platforms on the Oculus, you look behind you and somebody's bringing a whole conga line of dragons and you've already dismounted and you might wipe now. But above all that, the Oculus was a dungeon that really emphasized vehicle combat, and Wrath was full of it to be fair. But to have leveled your character, learned all your abilities, got your enchants and so on, and then you finally get into a dungeon and the game says, okay, now get on this vehicle and press about 2 buttons. It's just bad design in my opinion. And since I picked the Oculus for Wrath, that means I've left Violet Hold open as a choice for Legion, and it is the clear choice for Legion. Overall, there were so many good dungeons in this expansion, and it was Blizzard's first go at Mythic Plus 2, and since then they've had a lot more thought in designing dungeons around this feature. But for a first attempt, it was pretty good. Violet Hold, on the other hand, is just boring. I'm glad they didn't ever include it in the Mythic Plus rotation either during a Legion. It's a room where trash packs spawn and then you wait and then you kill a trash pack and then you wait some more and then another spawns and eventually a boss spawns and you kill the boss and you repeat 3 times and that is the entire dungeon. A magical prison is such a cool idea for a dungeon. In fact, Legion did the whole magical prison thing right with Vault of the Wardens, and yet for some reason we're reusing Dalaran, so I guess we're reusing Violet Hold, which is just a relic of Wrath of the Lich King, which we really could have done without. Which brings us to the unenviable spot of the top 3, and these 3 dungeons are really just on a different level of bad from everything else so far. First up is the entry from the Burning Crusade, and it is the Black Morass, aka opening of the Dark Portal. A trip back in time to ensure Medivh can open the Dark Portal. Now that sounds like an awesome premise for a dungeon, and then we get there and oh no, it's Violet Hold, kill X, wait again for a boss, kill the boss, repeat 3 times. But this time we've put the portals where the mobs spawn just far away from each other where you need to mount up each time. And this time you're in a lovely swamp setting alongside mobs that can daze you, water that can dismount you, and it even felt as though you had to wait longer in between stuff happening than the Violet Hold. I really feel bad for people who had to farm this place again and again for their Hourglass of the Unraveler trinket at the start of TBC Classic. This dungeon for me was I'm here to do the attunement and then I never want to come back. Which brings us to the top 2 worst dungeons, the loading screens that make me strongly consider having a sudden emergency and needing to leave the group. And the expansion in second place is Mists of Pandaria. Mists of Pandaria is an expansion where people have really 180'd their opinion on it from when it existed back in the day to nowadays. But I'm gonna be honest, it did not have very good dungeons. Realistically here, I could pick any of Siege of Nuzal Temple, Gate of the Setting Sun, or Storm Stout Brewery, but all of those pale in comparison to the worst dungeon of Mists of Pandaria, which for me is Temple of the Jade Serpent. Wow, this dungeon is just bad. You start off and you head left through a gauntlet into Wise Mori, who is easily one of the most boring boss designs Blizzard have ever put in the game, where you enter his room and he occasionally remembers that you are there and spawns a water elemental which you can evaporate in about 2 seconds before standing around and waiting for him to do this again. And then you have to go all the way back through to the entrance for some reason because they just decided you should backtrack in this dungeon. I'm not a fan of backtracking. Then you get another full room of trash and you finally get to the second boss, where it's a bedtime story with a Pandaren while you wait for the second boss to spawn. Eventually, once you've heard the story, which you've probably heard a bunch of times already so you're just waiting for it to be over, you can blow up the boss in a few seconds before you have to randomly run through a place with absolutely no trash to get to the final area. After that, the last 2 bosses are fine, to be honest. As I said in Mists of Pandaria, it was a close call with so many dungeons involving boss bosses with I go immune now mechanics and you needing to wait for RP. For Temple of the Jade Serpent, the first half of the dungeon especially really spoils it. There's a lot of waiting and a lot of backtracking, and for me this makes it a pretty poor dungeon experience. Which means last but not least is the entry from Cataclysm. How fresh it is in my mind now playing Cata Classic. And the choice here is easily Throne of the Tides. This dungeon just does an impressive number of things wrong. So you clear out a few trash packs and then you go straight into one of the longest lifts in the game. It feels about a solid minute or so of just standing and waiting there for the damn thing to come all the way back down again. And then you fight all the way through to the first boss, Lady Najjar, even though she should clearly be the last boss for lore reasons. More on this later. And this is perhaps the only dungeon ever where the lore has bothered me, by the way. We deal with her, we fight some old god Squid Boy, and then have to backtrack through the entire dungeon via the teleporter up to where the dungeon splits in 3 directions again. Backtracking, as I've already mentioned, just feels bad, and if it's an intended route through the dungeon, it feels like they just didn't plan it properly. I mean, there's backtracking in places such as Blackrock Depths, but BRD isn't a literal hallway. There are so many reasons to take different routes through the place, so it works there. In Throne, it's just annoying. I mean, they've had to put a teleporter there because they were like, damn, otherwise they're literally just going to have to run back through the entire dungeon that they've already done. And then there is an optional boss on the right hand side with some rather annoying trash in front of it, but that's fine. I can't say I've ever needed an item from this boss, so I didn't have to try and convince people to go this way, but if your Prebis was down here, I can imagine if you were pugging this dungeon a bunch, half the time the tank just straight up ignored you and took the left instead. And the left is down to the final boss, Neptulon. So I don't know if you've ever completed Vashia as a zone. I've done it a few times, and I think it's really not as bad as people make it out to be. Anyways, at the end of the zone there's a huge battle between the forces of the Naga and the Tide Lord, Neptulon. And Neptulon loses. Big time. In fact, it's a total disaster. The last you see of him in Vashia, he's lost his realm to the Naga and has a huge kraken stuck to his face, which all in all is probably not a good time. So when you finally get to him in Throne the Tides and his first comment is, my fearless assistance, considering your character has never even spoken to him or met him, is just a bit of a question mark moment. Neptulon, you literally just lost a devastating battle and had a sea monster on your face, and you finally get to him in the dungeon and he's like, well, you took your time, to be honest. And to top it off, his fight is absolutely terrible. Some of the waves are 1 elite at a time and some other ones are 3 non-elite Murlocs. Like, damn, should we set up a CC rotation here? This is insane. Before in the final phase, Neptulon juices you up, quite literally, and you defeat the Kraken, Ozumat. Even though you don't properly defeat him, he doesn't die, he just kind of runs off. I think the last we saw of him was during Najjar in BFA as far as I know. Anyways, all in all, it's both a disappointing end of zone story and a disappointing dungeon, which no other piece of 5-player content has managed to be ever in this game. And I do understand why the story's like this before I see the inevitable comments about it. Obviously, the end of Vashia was setting up for the Abyssal Maw raid, and there's even an instance portal where it would have been right next to the entrance to the Throne of the Tides. But Blizzard never got around to doing it because of, well, everything else they were doing in Cata, a large part of which was redesigning the old world. So we're just left with leftover bits that were put together in ultimately the worst dungeon World of Warcraft has ever produced. And that for me is the worst dungeon of each expansion so far. Now, I could have just done a top 10 type thing worst dungeon video, but there would have been at least 2 from TBC and probably 3 from Mists of Pandaria. So I decided instead I'll do 1 from each expansion and try and get a bit of variety in here. Though I could always do that in the future, let me know if you want to see that. Equally, I could do the best dungeon from every expansion, definitely down for that as well. But what did you think? What would be your list? Would you pick different dungeons? Did you agree? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you on the next one very soon.